Kansas, 1847. A desperate mother and her two starving daughters were caught stealing moldy fruit behind a stranger's barn until the man who found them did something nobody expected. What happened next would test the limits of kindness in a land where survival meant everything and trust meant nothing. This is a story of fire, blood, and the choices we make when hope runs dry. Stay until the end and comment the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The wind that November carried the smell of coming snow and dying grass, the kind of wind that reminded people they were small and the prairie was endless. Eleanor Graves pressed her back against the weathered planks of the barn, her breath coming in shallow clouds, and listened. Her daughters were beside her, Clara, 8 years old with her mother's dark hair, and Ruthie, barely 6, whose hollow cheeks made her look like a ghost of childhood rather than a child. They were silent because Eleanor had taught them that silence meant safety, that noise meant discovery, and discovery meant consequences they couldn't afford. "Mama," Ruthie whispered, her voice thin as paper, "my stomach hurts." Eleanor's heart cracked a little more. "I know, baby. I know." Behind them, scattered in the tall dead grass, were the apples they'd found, bruised, half-rotted things that had fallen from the tree weeks ago and been forgotten. Most people would have called them garbage. Eleanor called them providence. She'd already wiped 3 of them on her ragged skirt, scraping away the worst of the mold with her fingernails until her hands ached. It wasn't much. It wasn't enough. But it was something, and something was all that stood between her girls and the empty nothing that had been following them for months. Clara knelt beside her, working on another apple with the serious concentration of someone much older. She didn't complain anymore. That frightened Eleanor more than anything, the way her oldest daughter had stopped being a child and started being a survivor. Children should complain. Children should cry and demand and expect the world to give them what they needed. But Clara just worked, her small fingers efficient and determined, and said nothing at all. They'd been on the road for 4 months. 4 months since they'd lost the farm in Ohio, since the bank had come and taken everything, since Eleanor's husband Thomas had kissed her forehead and promised he'd make it right. "I'm going west," he'd said, his jaw set with the kind of determination that looked like strength but might have been desperation. "California. Gold. I'll send for you when I strike it. 6 months, maybe less. You'll see. Everything's going to be fine." That had been in June. It was November now, and the only letters she'd received had been silence. So she'd packed what they could carry, taken the girls, and started walking. If he wouldn't send for them, she'd find him herself. Or they'd make a new life somewhere, anywhere, far from the Ohio rain and the memories of everything they'd lost. It had seemed possible in June, when the weather was warm and the roads were full of other families heading west, when Ruthie still laughed and Clara still sang while they walked. Now it was November, and Kansas was a cold, gray place that didn't care whether they lived or died. Eleanor had sold everything that would fetch a price, her mother's silver brush, Thomas's good coat, even her wedding ring, though that had nearly killed her. The money had lasted longer than she'd expected, but not as long as she'd needed. Food was expensive on the frontier, and rooms were more expensive still. And there were always men who saw a woman alone with children and assumed things she wouldn't let them assume. She'd spent too many nights with a knife in her hand, listening to footsteps outside whatever door she'd managed to pay for, teaching herself not to sleep too deeply because sleep meant vulnerability. The money had run out 3 weeks ago outside of Lawrence. Since then, they'd been living on what they could find, what people would give them, what she could beg for without completely destroying her pride. She'd knocked on doors. She'd offered to work. Some people helped. Most didn't. The ones who helped usually wanted something in return that she wouldn't give, and the ones who didn't help looked at her like she was already dead, like she was a ghost haunting their doorsteps, a reminder of everything that could go wrong. Yesterday, they'd walked past this ranch, and Eleanor had seen the apple tree. It was set back from the house, half hidden behind the barn, heavy with fruit that was past saving. Nobody was picking them. Nobody was using them. They were just falling and rotting, and Eleanor had thought, she'd thought maybe nobody would notice if a few more disappeared. It was theft, technically. She knew that. But it was also survival, and she discovered that survival had a way of rewriting the rules you thought you'd always follow. They'd waited until dusk. They'd crept around the barn like criminals, like the kind of people she'd once judged, and started gathering the fallen fruit. The good ones were already gone, probably taken by whoever owned this place or eaten by animals. What remained were the rejects, soft with rot, crawling with ants, spotted with mold. Eleanor had seen Claire's face fall when she'd realized what they were collecting, had seen the moment her daughter understood that this was what they'd become. People who ate garbage because garbage was all that was left. "It's all right," Eleanor had whispered, even though it wasn't. "We'll clean them. We'll cut away the bad parts. It'll be fine." But Claire's eyes had said what her mouth wouldn't. "No, it won't." Now, crouched behind the barn in the fading light, Eleanor worked faster. They needed to gather what they could and go, find somewhere to spend the night, somewhere the wind wouldn't cut through their thin coats like a blade. She'd seen an abandoned soddy about a mile back. It wasn't much, probably crawling with mice and God knew what else, but it had walls and most of a roof, and that was more than they'd had the night before. She'd just reached for another apple when she heard it, the sound of boots in grass, the deliberate tread of someone who knew where they were going. Eleanor's blood went cold. "Stay down," she breathed to the girls, but it was too late. The footsteps were close now, coming around the corner of the barn, and there was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. She rose slowly, pulling Clara and Ruthie behind her, her mind racing through explanations that wouldn't sound like the lies they were. The man who rounded the corner was tall, broad-shouldered, with the weathered face of someone who'd spent his life working under the sun. He wore denim pants and a wool coat, good boots that had seen hard use but weren't worn through. His hat shaded his eyes, but Eleanor could feel his gaze taking them in, her threadbare dress, the girl's two thin frames, the rotting apples clutched in dirty hands. This was it. This was where he'd call her a thief, where he'd threaten the law or worse, where everything she'd been holding together would finally, completely fall apart. Eleanor lifted her chin, trying to find some scrap of dignity in the ruins of her pride. "Please, sir," she said, and her voice only shook a little. "We weren't stealing." It was the weakest lie she'd ever told, and they both knew it. The man, Caleb Holt, though she didn't know his name yet, stopped about 10 feet away. His eyes moved from Eleanor to the girls, taking in their hollow cheeks and frightened eyes, the way Ruthie was pressing herself against her mother's legs like she could disappear. He looked at the apples in their hands, the scattered collection of rotten fruit in the grass, and his face did something Eleanor hadn't expected. It softened. "No," he said quietly. "I don't suppose you were." Eleanor's breath caught. She'd been braced for anger, for accusations, for the kind of self-righteous fury that came from catching someone red-handed. But his voice held none of that. Instead, it carried something that sounded almost like sadness. Caleb shrugged out of his heavy wool coat. It had to have cost him at least a week's wages, maybe more, and held it out. "Ma'am," he said, "it's getting cold out here. Your girls are shivering. Why don't you all come inside? I've got a fire going and stew on the stove. No sense standing out here in the wind when there's warmth yonder." Eleanor stared at him. Her mind couldn't process what was happening. This wasn't how these situations went. She'd played out this scenario 100 times in her head during the past weeks, imagined every way it could go wrong, and not once had she imagined this. Kindness without strings, help without price. We can't," she stammered, even as every cell in her body screamed that they could, they had to. "We don't want charity." "It's not charity," Caleb said simply. "It's supper. There's a difference." He took a step closer, moving slowly, like he was approaching a spooked horse. Up close, Eleanor could see his face better, the lines around his eyes, the silver threading through his dark hair, the tiredness that came from years of hard work rather than hard living. He looked like someone who'd built something with his own hands and knew what it cost to keep it standing. "Listen," he said, and his voice was gentle in a way that made Eleanor's throat tight. "I don't know your story, ma'am, and you don't have to tell it, but I know hungry when I see it, and I know cold, and I know what it's like to be too proud to ask for help even when you're drowning. So I'm not asking you to accept charity. I'm asking you to come inside and eat some stew and get warm, and tomorrow you can be on your way, if that's what you want. But tonight you don't have to sleep in whatever ditch or abandoned building you were planning on. Tonight you can sleep somewhere safe." Clara's hand tightened on Eleanor's skirt. Ruthie had started to cry, silent tears tracking down her dirty cheeks, And Eleanor realized her youngest daughter was crying because someone was being kind to them, because kindness had become so rare that it felt like a miracle. "I can work," Eleanor heard herself say. "For the meal, for the shelter. I can cook, clean, mend clothes. I'm good with a needle. I can—" "Ma'am," Caleb's voice was firm but not harsh. "I'm not looking for a hired hand. I'm looking to do a decent thing for people who need it. Now, are you going to stand here arguing with me while your girls freeze, or are you going to let me do this one small thing that won't cost me anything, but might mean the difference between you all making it through another night?" Eleanor's eyes burned. When was the last time someone had spoken to her like she mattered? Like her survival was worth something? When was the last time anyone had looked at her daughters and seen children instead of burdens? "Why?" The word came out as barely more than a whisper. "Why would you help us?" Caleb was quiet for a moment, his gaze distant. "Because somebody once helped me when I needed it," he said finally, "and because there's already too much hardness in this world. Maybe it's time for a little softness." He held out the coat again. This time, Eleanor took it. The weight of it in her hands felt impossible. Not just the physical weight of good wool and solid stitching, but the weight of what it represented. Trust, humanity. The possibility that maybe, just maybe, they weren't completely alone in the vastness of this hard prairie. "Thank you," she whispered, and the words felt inadequate for what he was offering. Caleb nodded. "Come on then, before the stew burns." He turned and started toward the house, not looking back, giving them the dignity of choosing to follow rather than being led like livestock. Eleanor wrapped the coat around Ruthie first, drowning the little girl in wool that smelled like wood smoke and honest work, then draped it over Clara too, fitting both girls under it like a tent. "Mama?" Clara looked up at her with those two old eyes. "Is it safe?" God, Eleanor thought, what have I done to my children that they have to ask that question? "I think so, baby," she said, and made herself believe it. "I think maybe it is." They followed Caleb Holt across the darkening yard to his small homestead, and with each step Eleanor felt something shifting inside her. Not hope exactly, not yet, but maybe the memory of what hope used to feel like. The house was modest, just a single-room cabin with a stone chimney and shuttered windows, but light spilled from the cracks around the door, warm and golden and impossibly welcoming. Caleb held the door open. "Come in," he said simply. And Eleanor Graves, who hadn't trusted anyone in months, who'd learned that the world was hard and people were harder, who'd taught herself to expect nothing so disappointment couldn't reach her, Eleanor gathered her daughters close and stepped inside. The warmth hit them like a physical thing. After weeks of cold and wind and sleeping in places where their breath froze in the air, the heat from the stone fireplace felt like heaven itself. Eleanor stood just inside the door, suddenly aware of how filthy they must look, how they must smell, dirt and sweat and desperation. She opened her mouth to apologize, but Caleb was already moving, pulling chairs close to the fire, ladling stew into bowls with the easy efficiency of someone who'd cooked for himself for a long time. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the table. "Please." The girls didn't need to be told twice. They climbed onto the chairs, rough-hewn but sturdy like everything else in this place, and stared at the bowls Caleb set in front of them like they'd never seen food before. Maybe they hadn't. Not real food, not hot food, not food that was meant for them. "Go ahead," Caleb said. "It's just beef and vegetables. Nothing fancy, but it'll fill your bellies." Ruthie grabbed her spoon with both hands and dove in, too hungry to remember manners. Clara ate more slowly, but her eyes were fixed on the bowl with an intensity that made Eleanor's heart ache. When was the last time they'd had a hot meal? 10 days? 2 weeks? She couldn't remember anymore. The days had all blurred together into one long stretch of walking and hunger and trying not to think about what would happen when they couldn't walk anymore. Caleb set a bowl in front of Eleanor too, then ladled one for himself and sat down across from her. For a moment they ate in silence, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the scrape of spoons against pottery. Eleanor had never tasted anything so good. It was simple food, frontier food, the kind of meal a man living alone might make from whatever he had on hand. But it was hot, and there was plenty of it, and that made it a feast. "Thank you," she said again, because she couldn't stop saying it, because the words felt like the only thing standing between her and complete breakdown. "You don't know what this means." Caleb shrugged. "Like I said, it's just supper." "It's more than that." He was quiet for a moment, watching the girls eat. Ruthie had slowed down now, savoring each bite, her small face losing some of its tightness. Clara was trying to eat properly, trying to remember the manners Eleanor had taught her back when they lived in a house with furniture and plates that matched, back when Eleanor had still believed that teaching your children to sit up straight and say please and thank you would be enough to see them through life. "Where are you headed?" Caleb asked finally. Eleanor hesitated. The truth felt too big, too complicated. "West," she said. "California, maybe. My husband went there looking for gold. We're trying to catch up." "Long walk." "Yes. Dangerous walk, too, especially this time of year." Eleanor's hands tightened on her spoon. "I know, but we didn't have much choice." So Caleb studied her face, and Eleanor had the uncomfortable feeling that he could see past all her careful lies, straight through to the truth, that her husband was probably dead or had decided they weren't worth coming back for, that she had no plan beyond putting one foot in front of the other, that she was running on stubbornness and maternal desperation and absolutely nothing else. But he didn't call her on it. He just nodded. "How long you been on the road?" 4 months. We started in Ohio. Ohio to Kansas in 4 months, on foot, with 2 little ones. Caleb let out a low whistle. "That's something." "It's survival," Eleanor said flatly. "That's all." "Still something." Clara looked up from her bowl, her dark eyes finding Caleb's face. "Are you going to make us leave?" she asked, and the question held all the weight of experience, all the lessons she'd learned about how the world worked. "Clara," Eleanor said sharply, but Caleb held up a hand. "No," he said, speaking directly to the girl. "I'm not going to make you leave. Not tonight, anyway. Tonight you're going to eat until you're full, get warm by the fire, and sleep in an actual bed. Tomorrow we can talk about what comes next, but tonight you're safe here. I promise." "Promises break," Clara said, with the weariness of someone 3 times her age. "Sometimes," Caleb agreed. "But not this one." Ruthie had stopped eating, her eyelids drooping. She listed sideways in her chair, and Eleanor caught her automatically, pulling the little girl into her lap. Ruthie curled up against her mother's chest, thumb in her mouth, a habit she'd outgrown years ago but had returned to during these hard months, and let out a shuddering sigh. "There's a bed in the corner," Caleb said, gesturing to a rope-frame bed covered with quilts. "Put her down. Let her sleep." "I can't take your bed," Eleanor protested. "You're not taking it. I'm giving it. I can sleep in the chair by the fire. I've done it before." "But, ma'am," Caleb's voice was gentle but firm. "You're arguing again. Stop arguing and let me help. This isn't about pride or charity or any of that. This is about a little girl who needs to sleep somewhere warm and soft, and there's a bed right there. And I'm telling you to use it. That's all this is." Eleanor wanted to protest more. She wanted to maintain some semblance of independence, some proof that she wasn't completely helpless. But Ruthie was already asleep in her arms, her small body finally relaxed, and the bed did look impossibly soft compared to the hard ground they'd been sleeping on. "All right," she whispered. "Thank you." She carried Ruthie to the bed and laid her down gently, tucking the quilts around her thin frame. Her daughter didn't stir, lost in the kind of deep sleep that came from exhaustion, and finally, safety. Eleanor smoothed the dark hair back from Ruthie's forehead and felt something crack inside her chest, relief or grief, or maybe both at once. When she turned back, Clara had finished her stew and was struggling to keep her eyes open. Caleb had quietly cleared the bowls and was adding wood to the fire, giving them space, giving them privacy in a way that felt like respect. "You too, Clara," Eleanor said softly. "Bed. But you I'll be right here. I'm not going anywhere." Clara climbed into bed beside her sister, and Eleanor tucked her in too, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "Sleep, baby. Everything's going to be all right." She didn't know if that was true. She didn't know if anything would ever be all right again. But for tonight, in this warm cabin with a strange man who'd shown them kindness for no reason, she could pretend. She could give her daughters one night where they didn't have to be afraid. When she turned back to the fire, Caleb had settled into one of the chairs, his long legs stretched toward the hearth. He gestured to the other chair. Sit. Warm up. Eleanor sat, suddenly aware of how tired she was, how the adrenaline that had been keeping her upright for weeks was draining away now that there was finally space to rest. The fire crackled, sending shadows dancing across the rough-hewn walls. Outside, the November wind howled, but inside it was warm and quiet and almost peaceful. I need to explain, she said finally, because the silence was too much, because she needed him to understand. About the apples. I wouldn't normally. You were hungry, Caleb said simply. That's explanation enough. But I stole from you. You took fruit that was rotting on the ground. Fruit I was never going to use. Fruit that would have fed the worms and nothing else. That's not stealing. That's survival. Eleanor's eyes burned again, tears threatening to spill over. I used to judge people who stole, she whispered. I used to think if you were desperate enough to take something that wasn't yours, you'd made bad choices. You'd failed somehow. I thought good people, strong people found another way. And now? Now I know there isn't always another way. Now I know that sometimes the only choice is between your pride and your children's lives. And that's not really a choice at all. Caleb was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. 3 years ago, he said finally, I was where you are. Not exactly, but close enough. I had a wife, Sarah. She got sick, fever, and there wasn't a doctor close enough to help. I watched her die over 3 days, watched her slip away a little more each hour, and there was nothing I could do. Nothing. After that, I didn't care much about anything. Stopped tending the farm, stopped eating regular, stopped seeing the point of going on. I was just existing, waiting to join her, I suppose. He paused, and Eleanor waited, sensing there was more. One day a family came through, he continued. Settlers heading west, just passing through. They saw me in the field. I was drunk, probably, or close to it. And the woman, she just came over and started talking to me. Didn't judge, didn't preach, just talked. Her husband brought me water. Their kids played in my yard. And when they left the next morning, the woman made me promise something. What? She made me promise that if I ever got the chance to help someone the way they'd helped me, just by being kind, just by seeing another person's pain and not looking away, I'd do it. No questions, no conditions, just help, because that's what we're supposed to do for each other. Eleanor swallowed hard. And did you keep the promise? Caleb looked at her, and in the firelight his eyes were warm. I'm trying, he said. Every day I'm trying. They sat in silence after that, but it was a comfortable silence, the kind that didn't need filling. Eleanor watched the fire and listened to her daughters breathe in sleep and felt something she hadn't felt in so long she'd almost forgotten what it was called, peace. What's your name? Caleb asked eventually. Eleanor. Eleanor Graves. And my daughters are Clara and Ruthie. Caleb Holt. He nodded toward the bed. They're good girls. You can see it, even in the hard times. They're the best thing I ever did, Eleanor said softly. The only thing that matters now. Your husband, the one who went west, you think he's still alive? It was a question Eleanor had been avoiding for months, the one that sat in her chest like a stone. I don't know, she admitted. He was supposed to send for us. He promised. But it's been 5 months and I haven't heard anything. Maybe the letters got lost. Maybe he hasn't struck gold yet and he's waiting until he can send money. Maybe he's not coming back, Caleb finished gently. Eleanor nodded, her throat too tight for words. And if he's not, if you get to California and he's not there, or he's there but he's not the man you thought he was, what then? I don't know that either, Eleanor whispered. I just know I have to keep moving forward because stopping means giving up, and I can't give up. Not while they need me. She looked at her daughters sleeping peacefully under borrowed quilts in a stranger's bed and felt the weight of all the choices that had led her here. Every bad decision, every moment of hope and desperation and stubborn refusal to quit. She'd made mistakes. God knew she'd made mistakes. But she was still here. They were still here. That had to count for something. You're stronger than you think, Caleb said quietly. Walking from Ohio to Kansas with two little ones, keeping them alive, keeping them together, that takes a kind of strength most people don't have, or a kind of stubbornness. Same thing sometimes. Eleanor managed a weak smile. Maybe. They talked for a while longer, their voices low so as not to wake the children. Caleb told her about the ranch, small but his, built with his own hands after Sarah died because he needed something to do with the grief. Eleanor told him about Ohio, about the farm they'd lost, about Thomas's dreams of gold and the way those dreams had pulled their family apart. She didn't tell him everything. There were some pains too private to share, some failures too deep to speak aloud. But she told him enough. Enough for him to understand. Enough for her to feel less alone. Eventually the fire burned low and exhaustion won. Caleb insisted Eleanor take the bed with her daughters. You'll all fit, and I'm fine in the chair. I've slept in worse places. And after one more half-hearted protest, she gave in. She climbed into bed between Clara and Ruthie, fully dressed, and pulled the quilts up to her chin. The bed was soft. The quilts were warm. Her daughters were breathing steady and safe on either side of her. For the first time in months, Eleanor Graves let herself relax, let herself believe that maybe they'd survive this after all, let herself close her eyes without fear of what morning might bring. In the chair by the dying fire, Caleb Holt watched them sleep and thought about promises. About the promise a stranger had made him keep 3 years ago. About the promise he'd just made to a frightened little girl with old eyes. About the promises we make to ourselves when the world goes dark, and whether any of us are strong enough to keep them. Outside, the Kansas wind howled across the empty prairie, cold and endless and indifferent. But inside, in this small warm cabin, 3 people who'd been drowning had found something solid to hold on to. It wasn't much. It wasn't a solution to all their problems. But it was shelter and warmth and kindness. And for one night, that was enough. Eleanor's last thought before sleep took her was this. Maybe the world isn't completely hard. Maybe there's still softness left, still grace, still people who help for no reason except that it's right. Maybe we're not as alone as we think. And with that thought, fragile and tentative and desperately hopeful, she let herself sleep, truly sleep, for the first time since Ohio. Beside her, Clara and Ruthie dreamed of full bellies and warm fires and the kind man who'd given them his coat. And by the hearth, Caleb Holt kept watch through the night, standing guard over 3 strangers who'd stumbled into his life carrying nothing but hunger and hope and each other. The fire burned low. The wind died down. And for one night in November 1847, in a small cabin on the Kansas prairie, kindness won. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. Tomorrow, they'd have to figure out what came next. But that was tomorrow's problem. Tonight, they were safe. Tonight, they were home. Morning came too soon and not soon enough. Eleanor woke to the smell of coffee and frying bacon, scent so foreign after weeks of hunger that for a moment she thought she was dreaming. Then Clara shifted beside her, and Ruthie's small hand found hers beneath the quilts, and she remembered the barn, the rotten apples, the man who'd offered them his coat, and called it nothing. Pale sunlight filtered through the cabin's single window, weak November light that promised nothing but cold. Eleanor sat up carefully, not wanting to wake the girls, and saw Caleb at the stove, his back to her, working with the quiet efficiency of someone accustomed to solitude. He'd already dressed for the day, work clothes, patched but clean, and his hair was damp like he'd washed at the pump outside despite the freezing temperature. He must have heard her move because he glanced over his shoulder. "Morning," he said softly. "Didn't mean to wake you." "You didn't." Eleanor swung her legs out of bed, suddenly aware of how wrinkled her dress was, how tangled her hair must be. She'd slept in her clothes, had been sleeping in her clothes for weeks because there was nothing else and nowhere private to change, even if there had been. "I should help. You shouldn't be cooking for us." "Already done." Caleb gestured to the table where he'd laid out plates and cups. "Just bacon and cornbread, but it's hot. Coffee too, if you want it." Eleanor wanted to argue, wanted to prove she wasn't helpless, but the truth was she was starving and exhausted, and the smell of that bacon was making her dizzy. "Thank you," she said instead, and the words were becoming a refrain, a prayer she couldn't stop repeating. "You've been so kind." stop thanking me," Caleb said, but there was no harshness in it. "Makes me feel like I'm doing something extraordinary when I'm just doing what's decent." He poured coffee into a tin cup and brought it to her. Eleanor wrapped her hands around it, savoring the warmth, the bitter smell that spoke of normalcy and morning routines and all the small comforts she'd taken for granted back when she'd had a home. She sipped carefully. It was strong and hot and perfect, and felt something in her chest loosen just a fraction. Behind her, Ruthie stirred. "Mama?" "I'm here, baby." Ruthie sat up, her hair a wild tangle around her face, and looked around the cabin with confused eyes. For a moment, Eleanor saw panic flash across her daughter's face, the instinctive fear of waking somewhere strange. But then Ruthie spotted the stove and the food and Caleb's gentle smile, and her expression shifted to something like wonder. "Is it real?" she whispered. "The breakfast?" Eleanor's heart broke a little more. "Yes, sweetheart. It's real." Clara woke more slowly, her old soul eyes taking in the scene with careful assessment before she allowed herself to relax. She climbed out of bed and came to stand beside Eleanor, her small hand finding her mother's free one, and together they watched Caleb dish bacon onto plates with the same care he might have used for guests at a fancy dinner. "Come eat," he said, "before it gets cold." They ate at the rough table like a family, though they weren't one, though they'd known each other for less than 12 hours. Caleb asked the girls about their journey, gentle questions that didn't press too hard, and Clara answered in careful sentences while Ruthie mostly just ate, her attention fixed on the food like it might vanish if she looked away. Eleanor listened and sipped her coffee and tried not to think about what would happen when this meal was over, when they'd have to leave this warm cabin and walk back out into the cold. "There's a town about 8 miles north," Caleb said eventually, speaking to Eleanor while the girls finished their breakfast. "Independence. It's not much, but they've got supplies, a boarding house, folks heading west who might have news about your husband. You might find some answers there." Eleanor nodded. 8 miles. On a good day, before they'd been walking for months, that would have been nothing. Now it felt like 100. "We'll head out after breakfast," she said. "We've imposed on you enough." Caleb frowned. "You haven't imposed, but if you're set on leaving, at least let me give you some provisions. I've got dried beef, some cornmeal, a spare blanket. It's getting colder and you can't be sleeping rough with those girls." "We can't take your things." "You can, and you will." There was steel under the gentleness now, the firmness of a man who'd made up his mind. "I won't send you out there with nothing. Don't ask me to." Eleanor opened her mouth to protest, but Clara spoke first. "Mama, please, just say yes." The desperation in her daughter's voice cut through all of Eleanor's pride. Clara was 8 years old, and she shouldn't have to beg for basic survival. Shouldn't have to understand that pride was a luxury they couldn't afford. But she did understand, and that understanding was visible in every line of her thin face. "All right," Eleanor whispered. "Thank you." Caleb stood and started gathering supplies. A burlap sack that he filled with cornmeal, strips of dried beef wrapped in cloth, 2 apples that weren't rotten, a small tin of lard. He pulled a wool blanket from a chest in the corner, gray and worn but whole, and folded it carefully before adding it to the pile. Eleanor watched him work and felt tears threatening again. This man owed them nothing. They were strangers who'd been caught stealing from him, and yet here he was, giving them what might be the difference between life and death. "The boarding house in Independence," Caleb said as he worked. "It's run by a woman named Martha Hayes. Good woman, fair. You tell her I sent you, she might give you a decent rate. She's helped folks before." "You've done so much already," Eleanor said. "We can't ask you to each. You're not asking, I'm offering. There's a difference." He tied the sack closed and set it by the door along with the blanket. Then he went to the mantel and took down a small leather pouch, counted out coins with deliberate care, 5 silver dollars that clinked softly in his palm, and held them out to Eleanor. "No." Eleanor stepped back. "Absolutely not. The food, the shelter, that's one thing, but I can't take your money. It's not much. Just enough for a few nights at the boarding house, maybe some extra food." "I don't care if it's everything you have. I won't take it." Eleanor's voice was sharp now, pride flaring despite everything. "You've been generous beyond reason, but there's a line, and that crosses it. We're not beggars." I never said you were. Then stop treating us like we are. The words came out harder than she'd intended, fueled by shame and exhaustion and the horrible feeling of being dependent on someone else's charity. Caleb didn't flinch. He just looked at her with those steady eyes and said, I'm treating you like human beings who need help. That's all. Nothing more, nothing less. But why? Eleanor's voice cracked. Why do you care what happens to us? We're nobody to you. We're just 3 more people trying to survive on a frontier full of people trying to survive. Why does it matter to you if we make it or not? Caleb was quiet for a long moment. Behind them, Clara and Ruthie had stopped eating, their eyes wide as they watched the adults. Finally, Caleb set the coins on the table, not forcing them into Eleanor's hand but leaving them there, available, a choice rather than an obligation. I told you about Sarah, he said quietly. What I didn't tell you was how she died. The fever came on sudden, and I rode to town for the doctor. 10 miles there, 10 miles back. I rode that horse like the devil was chasing me. But when I got to the doctor's house, he turned me away. Eleanor's breath caught. Said he was busy with other patients, Caleb continued, his voice flat now, drained of emotion. Said he'd come when he could, but he couldn't promise when that would be. I begged him. I told him my wife was dying. He looked at me and said, everyone thinks their emergency is the only one that matters. Then he closed the door in my face. God, Eleanor whispered. I rode home alone. Sarah died that night, calling for me, scared and in pain, and I couldn't do anything but hold her hand and watch. And all I could think was, if that doctor had just come, if he'd just shown her one shred of mercy, maybe she'd still be here. Maybe I wouldn't be alone. Caleb met Eleanor's eyes, and she saw a grief there that matched her own, a pain that ran bone deep and permanent. So when I see people who need help, he said, I help them. Because I know what it's like to need help and not get it. I know what it costs. And I'll be damned if I'm going to be the man who closes the door. The cabin was silent except for the crackling of the fire. Eleanor felt something shifting in her chest, the walls she'd built around herself cracking just enough to let light through. This man had lost everything too. He understood. He knew what it was to watch your world fall apart and have nobody catch you. I'm sorry, she said finally, about your wife, about what that doctor did to you. Me too. Every day. Caleb nodded toward the coins. Take the money. Not because you're begging, not because you're helpless, but because you need it, and I have it, and there's no reason you should suffer when I can help. That's all this is. Just one person helping another, the way we're supposed to. Eleanor looked at the silver dollars gleaming on the table. $5. Enough for maybe a week at a boarding house, enough for food and supplies, enough to buy them time to figure out what came next. It wasn't charity, it was a lifeline. If we take this, she said slowly, I'll pay you back. Somehow, someday, I'll find a way to pay you back. If it makes you feel better to think that, fine. But I'm not keeping a ledger. I'm not expecting anything in return. Eleanor picked up the coins, her hand shaking slightly. They were warm from Caleb's palm, solid and real. Thank you, she whispered, and this time the words carried weight beyond courtesy, beyond politeness. This time they carried the full measure of her gratitude, her desperate relief, her tentative hope that maybe they'd survive this after all. Caleb just nodded and went back to the stove. They finished breakfast in a more comfortable silence. Clara asked Caleb about the ranch, how long he'd been here, what crops he grew, whether he had animals, and he answered her questions with the patience of someone who understood that children needed normalcy, needed to talk about ordinary things even in extraordinary circumstances. Ruthie fell asleep again in her chair, exhausted despite a full night's rest, and Eleanor realized with a pang how much her daughters had been running on adrenaline and fear, how much they'd been holding themselves together through sheer will. Let her sleep a bit longer, Caleb said, seeing Eleanor start to wake her. No rush. The road will still be there in an hour. So they waited. Eleanor helped Caleb clean the breakfast dishes. He tried to wave her off, but she insisted, needing to do something useful, needing to feel less like a burden. Clara explored the cabin with careful curiosity, examining Caleb's few possessions with the fascination of a child who'd been living rough for too long. A carved wooden box, a well-worn Bible, a tintype photograph on the mantel showing a young woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. "That's Sarah?" Clara asked, pointing to the photograph. Caleb nodded. "Taken on our wedding day." "She's pretty." She was beautiful, inside and out. Clara studied the photograph for a long moment. "Do you miss her?" "Every day." "My mama misses my papa," Clara said matter-of-factly. "Even though he left us, even though he might not come back, she tries to hide it, but I can tell." Eleanor froze at the wash basin, her hands still in the soapy water. She'd thought she'd been hiding it better than that, thought she'd been protecting her daughters from the full weight of her fear and uncertainty. But Clara saw everything. Clara understood too much. "Love doesn't stop just because someone's gone," Caleb said gently. "That's not how it works. Your mama loved your papa, and she probably still does, even if she's angry at him too. People are complicated that way." "Are you angry at Sarah for dying?" Eleanor spun around, shocked, but Caleb just gave Clara a sad smile. "Sometimes," he admitted, "even though I know that's not fair, even though she didn't choose to leave. Sometimes I'm angry anyway, because anger is easier than grief." Clara nodded slowly, absorbing this. "I'm angry at Papa," she said in a small voice, "for leaving us, for making us walk and never having enough food. Mama says I shouldn't be angry, says he's doing his best, but I don't care. I'm angry anyway." "That's allowed," Caleb told her. "Anger is just love with nowhere to go. It doesn't make you bad. It just makes you human." Eleanor's throat tightened. When had she become so focused on survival that she'd stopped seeing what her daughters were carrying? Claire was 8 years old and wrestling with emotions most adults couldn't process, and Eleanor had been too consumed with keeping them fed and moving forward to notice. Some mother she was. "Clara," she said softly, "come here." Her daughter came, wary, like she thought she might be in trouble. Eleanor pulled her close, wrapping her arms around the thin frame, and held on tight. "I'm sorry," she whispered into Clara's hair. "I'm sorry you're angry. I'm sorry Papa left. I'm sorry for all of it. You shouldn't have to carry this." "You're carrying it too," Clara said against her mother's shoulder. "I can tell. You're just pretending you're not." Eleanor looked over her daughter's head and found Caleb watching them with an expression that might have been understanding or might have been grief, probably both. "We're all carrying too much," she said quietly, "but we're carrying it together. That's something, isn't it?" Clara nodded. "I guess so." They stood like that for a moment, mother and daughter clinging to each other in a stranger's cabin while the morning light grew stronger outside and the fire burned low in the hearth. Then Ruthie stirred in her chair, rubbing sleep from her eyes, and the moment passed. Reality came rushing back. They were still displaced, still traveling, still searching for something that might not exist. "We should get ready," Eleanor said, releasing Clara reluctantly. "We've stayed too long as it is." But even as she said it, part of her wanted to stay. Part of her wanted to never leave this cabin, this warmth, this unexpected pocket of safety in a harsh world. Part of her wanted to ask Caleb if they could stay, not forever, just for a few more days, just until they were stronger. But pride strangled the words before they could form. Caleb seemed to sense her hesitation. "You could wait another day," he suggested. "Rest up properly. There's weather coming. I can smell it. Might be better to wait it out here rather than getting caught on the road." "We've been enough trouble," Eleanor said automatically. "You haven't been any trouble at all. You're just being polite." "I'm being honest." Caleb crossed his arms, his expression firm. "Look, I'm not going to force you to stay. If you're determined to leave, I'll send you off with provisions and directions, and you'll be on your way. But use your head, ma'am. There's a storm building, your girls are exhausted, and independence isn't going anywhere. One more day won't make a difference to your journey, but it might make the difference between arriving alive or not arriving at all." Eleanor looked at her daughters. Ruthie was already nodding off again, her small body still catching up on months of insufficient sleep. Clara was trying to look strong, trying to look ready, but her eyes held a pleading quality that broke Eleanor's heart. Neither of them wanted to go back out into the cold. Neither of them wanted to walk another 8 miles on empty stomachs with nothing but fear and hope for fuel. "I don't want to be a burden." Eleanor said, but the words were weaker now, her resistance crumbling. You're not a burden. You're a mother trying to keep her children safe. There's a difference. Eleanor closed her eyes. Every instinct screamed at her to be independent, to prove she could handle this alone, to protect what little dignity she had left. But stronger than instinct was the bone-deep exhaustion, the knowledge that she was running on fumes, that one more day might be what they needed to survive the next week. One more day, she heard herself say. Just one. And we work for our keep. I'll cook, clean, whatever you need. Fair enough, Caleb agreed, though his eyes suggested he'd have let them stay regardless. Though you should know I'm a simple man with simple needs. Don't expect me to invent chores just to make you feel useful. I'll find something to do. I'm sure you will. And so it was decided. They would stay. Just one more day, just enough time to rest and gather strength and pretend for a little while longer that they were somewhere safe. The storm Caleb had predicted rolled in around midday. Heavy clouds that turned the sky the color of old bruises, wind that howled across the prairie and made the cabin's timbers creak. Eleanor stood at the window and watched the first fat drops of rain turn to sleet, watched the temperature plummet and the world outside become hostile and gray, and felt a rush of gratitude so intense it made her dizzy. If they'd left this morning, they'd be caught in this. They'd be huddled under that thin blanket trying to shield the girls from weather that didn't care whether they lived or died. Good call, she said to Caleb, who was mending a harness at the table. I've lived here long enough to read the sky, he replied. Storm like this, it'll blow through by tomorrow. You'll have clear weather for your walk to Independence. Eleanor turned from the window. How did you end up here? In Kansas, I mean. You don't have the look of someone who was born on the prairie. I'm not. Born in Pennsylvania, actually. Came west with Sarah after we married. She wanted adventure, wanted to see something beyond the hills we'd grown up in. I wanted her to be happy. He smiled sadly. So we sold everything, packed a wagon, and headed west with 100 other fools chasing dreams. And you found yours? For a while. Built this place with my own hands, cleared the land, planted crops. Sarah loved it. She'd stand outside in the evenings and watch the sunset and say this was what freedom looked like. Wide open spaces, nobody telling us what to do or who to be, just us and the land and possibility. He paused, his hand stilling on the leather. Then she got sick and all that possibility meant nothing. You can have all the land in the world, but it won't keep the people you love safe. No, Eleanor agreed quietly. It won't. They worked in companionable silence for a while, Caleb on his harness, Eleanor mending a tear in Ruthie's dress with needle and thread Caleb had produced from somewhere. The girls played quietly in the corner, creating stories with small stones they'd arranged like dolls. Outside, the storm raged. Inside, the fire crackled and the cabin held. Tell me about Ohio, Caleb said eventually. What was your life like before all this? Eleanor considered the question. It felt like someone else's life now, someone else's story. We had a small farm, she said slowly. Nothing fancy, but it was ours. Thomas worked hard, grew wheat mostly, some vegetables. I kept the house, raised the girls, made butter and cheese to sell in town. It was simple, good. I thought it would last forever. What happened? Bad harvest 2 years in a row. Then Thomas borrowed money to plant again, thinking the third year would be better. It wasn't. The bank came. They gave us 30 days to pay or leave. Thomas couldn't accept it. Losing the farm felt like losing himself. That's when he started talking about California, about gold, about how we could start fresh and build something even better. But you didn't want to go. No, Eleanor admitted. I didn't. I wanted to find work, find a way to pay the debt slowly. I told him we could rebuild right there, that Ohio was our home. But he was desperate, and desperate men don't listen. They act. So he left you, Caleb said, not quite a question. He said he was going ahead to establish himself, that he'd send for us as soon as he struck gold. He promised he'd write every week, send money when he could. He kissed me goodbye and told me he loved me and walked away like he was going to save us all. Eleanor's voice hardened. That was 5 months ago. Not a single letter, not a single dollar, just silence. And you still went looking for him. What choice did I have? Without the farm, without money, we had nothing. No family willing to take us in, no prospects, no future. At least going west gave us direction. At least it gave us hope, even if that hope was probably false. Caleb set down his work and looked at her directly. Can I ask you something? What will you do if you find him and he's remarried? Or if you find him and he doesn't want you back? Or if you don't find him at all? The questions hit like stones, each one landing on a fear Eleanor had been avoiding for months. I don't know, she whispered. I try not to think that far ahead. I just focus on the next step, the next meal, the next mile. If I let myself think about all the ways this could end badly, I'd never get out of bed in the morning. That's fair. But eventually you'll have to think about it. Eventually you'll have to have a plan that doesn't depend on Thomas. I know. Eleanor's hands trembled slightly on the needle. But not today. Today, I just need to get through today. Caleb nodded slowly. All right, but when you're ready to think about tomorrow, about next week, about what comes after, remember that there are people who'll help. Not everyone's heartless. Not everyone will close the door. Eleanor met his eyes and saw something there that made her breath catch. Not pity, not charity, but genuine care. This man barely knew her, had known her for less than a day, and yet he cared what happened to her and her daughters. He cared enough to give them shelter and food and money he probably couldn't spare. He cared enough to look at her like she was a person worth saving. Why are you being so kind to us? She asked, needing to understand. And don't say it's because someone helped you once. There's more to it than that, I can tell. Caleb was quiet for so long Eleanor thought he wouldn't answer. Then, because you remind me of her, of Sarah. The way you protect your girls, the way you do anything to keep them safe. Sarah would have been the same. She wanted children. We were trying before she got sick, and sometimes I look at Clara and Ruthie, and I think, those could have been mine. That could have been my family. And I can either be angry about what I lost, or I can honor what I had by helping someone else build what I never got to finish. Eleanor felt tears slip down her cheeks. That's beautiful. That's grief finding purpose. There's a difference. Maybe, but it's still beautiful. They held each other's gaze for a moment, and something passed between them. Understanding, maybe, or recognition. Two broken people trying to find meaning in a world that had taken too much from both of them. Then Ruthie called out, "Mama, look!" And the moment broke. The rest of the day passed quietly. The storm continued its assault outside while they stayed warm and dry within. Eleanor cooked a simple supper with the supplies Caleb had, beans and cornbread, nothing fancy but filling, and they ate together as the light faded and the temperature dropped further. Caleb told the girls stories about the prairie, about buffalo herds so vast they took days to pass, about storms that could blow a house down and floods that reshaped the land overnight. Clara listened with wide eyes. Ruthie fell asleep in her chair again. When it was time for bed, Eleanor tucked her daughters in and kissed them goodnight, then returned to the fire where Caleb sat smoking his pipe, the tobacco smoke curling up toward the rafters. "Thank you," she said, settling into the other chair, "for giving us another day, for all of this." "Stop thanking me," Caleb said, but there was warmth in it now, almost affection. "You've thanked me about 50 times since yesterday. I'm starting to think you don't know any other words." Eleanor laughed, actually laughed, and was surprised by the sound. When was the last time she'd laughed? "I mean it, though. You've been so generous. And you've been so stubborn about accepting help. We're even." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the fire. Outside, the storm was finally beginning to ease, the sleet turning back to rain, the wind losing its edge. By morning, it would be clear, just as Caleb had predicted. By morning, they'd have to leave this small, warm sanctuary and walk back out into the cold world. "I'm scared," Eleanor admitted quietly, surprising herself with the confession. "I'm scared we won't make it. I'm scared I'll fail them. I'm scared of what we'll find if we ever reach California. I'm scared of everything. That's normal. Fear keeps you careful. But how do you keep going when you're so afraid you can barely breathe?" Caleb considered the question. "You just do," he said finally. "You put one foot in front of the other because stopping means giving up, and you're not ready to give up yet. You focus on the next step, not the whole journey. And you remember that fear and courage aren't opposites. Courage is just fear that's decided to move forward anyway. Eleanor nodded, absorbing his words. You're wise. I'm old and sad. Sometimes that looks like wisdom. It's still helpful. They talked a while longer, their voices low, sharing pieces of themselves the way strangers sometimes do when they know they'll likely never see each other again. Caleb told Eleanor about his childhood in Pennsylvania, about learning to work wood from his father, about the day he met Sarah at a church social and knew immediately she was the one. Eleanor told him about her parents, long dead, about how she'd met Thomas when she was 16 and thought he hung the moon, about the slow realization that the man she'd married wasn't quite the man she'd thought he was. Eventually, exhaustion won. Eleanor said goodnight and climbed into bed beside her daughters, and Caleb settled into his chair by the fire with a blanket. The cabin grew quiet. The storm outside faded to nothing, and Eleanor lay there in the darkness, listening to her daughters breathe, thinking about tomorrow and all the tomorrows that would follow. They'd have to leave in the morning. They'd have to walk to Independence and figure out what came next. But tonight they were safe, warm, fed. Tonight they had shelter and kindness, and the care of a good man who'd chosen to help them for no reason except that it was right. And maybe, Eleanor thought as sleep finally claimed her, maybe that was enough to get them through tomorrow. Maybe kindness was stronger than fear after all. Maybe they'd survive this. She closed her eyes and let herself believe it, just for tonight. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, its own terrors, but that was tomorrow's problem. Tonight, they were home. The dawn that broke over Kansas was crystalline and cold, the kind of morning where everything looked sharp-edged and new. Eleanor woke to find frost patterns on the window glass and Caleb already up, adding wood to the fire. She lay still for a moment, reluctant to leave the warmth of the quilts, reluctant to face the day that would take them away from this place. "Morning," Caleb said without turning around. "Storm's past, sky's clear, good day for traveling." Eleanor sat up, careful not to wake the girls. "I suppose it is. Coffee's ready when you are, and I've got Johnny cakes on the griddle." "You didn't have to." "I know I didn't have to. I wanted to." He finally looked at her, and his expression was gentle. "Let me give you a proper send-off, at least. It's the last I can do." So they had one more meal together, the four of them crowded around the small table while frost glittered outside and the fire crackled within. The Johnny cakes were simple but delicious, sweetened with a bit of molasses Caleb had been saving, and the girls ate slowly, savoring each bite like they knew they wouldn't eat this well again for a while. Eleanor watched them and felt her heart fracture just a little more. 2 days ago, they'd been eating rotten apples behind a barn. Now they were sitting at a table like human beings, like they mattered, like their survival was worth something. "The road to Independence runs straight north," Caleb said, sketching a rough map on a scrap of paper with a piece of charcoal. "Follow it about 8 miles, maybe 9. You'll see the town before you reach it, church steeples visible for a good distance. When you get there, find the boarding house. 2-story building, white paint, sign that says Hayes House. Tell Martha I sent you." Eleanor folded the paper carefully and tucked it into her pocket. "We will. Thank you. And if she's full, or if something goes wrong, there's a general store run by a man named Cooper. He's decent enough. He might know of other places to stay." "Caleb," Eleanor said softly, "you've given us so much already. The food, the shelter, the money, the directions. You've been more than generous. I'm just making sure you have the best chance possible." He looked at the girls, his expression serious. "You take care of your mama, you hear? She's doing her best, and the road's hard, but you stick together and you'll come through all right." Clara nodded solemnly. "We will, I promise. Good girl." They finished breakfast too quickly. There was no legitimate reason to linger. The weather was clear, the road was passable. Independence was waiting. But Eleanor found herself moving slowly as she gathered their few belongings, as she wrapped the girls in their threadbare coats and the blanket Caleb had given them. Ruthie clung to her mother's skirt, sensing that something was ending, that safety was becoming temporary again. Caleb packed the provisions he'd prepared into the burlap sack, enough dried beef and cornmeal to last them several days if they were careful, plus the apples and a small pouch of salt he insisted they take. He added a tin cup, a box of matches wrapped in oilcloth, and a folding knife with a worn wooden handle. "That was my father's," he said when Eleanor started to protest about the knife. "He'd have wanted it to go to someone who needed it. It's sharp, so be careful, but it'll serve you well for cutting rope or preparing food or whatever you might need it for." Eleanor held the knife in her palm, feeling the weight of it, the significance. This wasn't just a tool. This was a piece of Caleb's history, a connection to his past, and he was giving it to her like it was nothing. "I can't take this," she whispered. "You can, and you will. I'm not taking no for an answer." "But, Eleanor." The use of her first name stopped her. Caleb stepped closer, his voice dropping. "Take the knife. Take all of it. And when you get to where you're going, when you're safe and settled, you remember that there are good people in this world. You remember that kindness exists. And then you pass it on to someone else who needs it. That's all I ask." Tears blurred Eleanor's vision. "I'll remember," she managed. "I promise, I'll remember." Caleb nodded and stepped back, giving her space to compose herself. Clara was watching them with those two knowing eyes, understanding more than any 8-year-old should. Ruthie had found a stick and was drawing patterns in the dirt floor, humming tunelessly, lost in her own world. "Time to go," Eleanor said, her voice stronger than she felt. "Girls, say thank you to Mr. Holt." "Thank you," Clara said promptly, moving to stand beside Caleb. Then, without warning, she threw her arms around his waist and hugged him tight. "Thank you for being kind when nobody else was. Thank you for helping us. Thank you for everything." Caleb's eyes went bright with unshed tears. He bent down and returned the embrace, his large hands gentle on the little girl's back. "You're welcome, Clara. You're going to be just fine. You're strong like your mama. Don't forget that." Ruthie joined the hug, not wanting to be left out, and for a moment Caleb knelt there with both girls in his arms, while Eleanor watched and tried not to fall completely apart. This man had given them more than food and shelter. He'd given them hope. He'd reminded them that humanity still existed, that not everyone was cruel or indifferent, that sometimes strangers became saviors for no reason except that it was right. When the girls finally released him, Caleb stood and turned to Eleanor. For a moment they just looked at each other, and Eleanor saw in his face everything she was feeling, sadness at parting, hope for their future, the strange intimacy that came from shared vulnerability. "You're going to make it," he said quietly. "I know you will. I hope you're right. I am. You're stronger than you think." Eleanor wanted to hug him too, wanted to thank him one more time, wanted to tell him that these 2 days had meant more than he could possibly understand. But the words wouldn't come, stuck in her throat behind emotion too big to express. So she just nodded, hoisted the burlap sack over her shoulder, and took her daughter's hands. "Come on, girls. Long walk ahead." They stepped out into the cold Kansas morning, and Eleanor didn't let herself look back. If she looked back, she'd want to stay, and staying wasn't possible. They had to keep moving forward. That was the only direction left. The road to Independence was rutted and hard frozen, the mud turned solid by the cold night. Eleanor set a steady pace, not too fast. The girls couldn't manage fast, but not so slow that they'd still be walking when darkness fell. The sun was bright, but provided little warmth, and the wind across the open prairie cut through their coats like they were made of paper. But they had the blanket Caleb had given them, and they had food in the sack, and they had each other. It was more than they'd had 3 days ago. They'd been walking for perhaps an hour when Ruthie spoke up. "Mama, my feet hurt." "I know, baby. Just keep walking. We'll rest soon." "But they really hurt. Can't we stop?" Eleanor glanced down and saw that her youngest daughter was limping slightly. The shoes Ruthie wore, hand-me-downs from Clara that had been old to begin with, were falling apart, the soles separating from the uppers. They wouldn't last much longer. Eleanor's own shoes were barely better. Only Clara's were reasonably intact, and that was only because Eleanor had spent precious pennies getting them resold in Lawrence 3 weeks ago. "All right," Eleanor said, guiding them to the side of the road where a fallen log provided a place to sit. "We'll rest for a few minutes, but just a few. We need to reach Independence before dark." They sat huddled together, sharing the blanket, while Eleanor examined Ruthie's shoes. They were worse than she'd thought. Not just worn, but actually coming apart. The thread rotted, the leather cracked. She could maybe tie them together with string, but that was a temporary fix at best. Ruthie needed new shoes. They all did. The $5 Caleb had given her seemed to burn in Eleanor's pocket. New shoes would cost at least $1, maybe more. That would leave her with $4 for lodging and food. $4 wouldn't last long, but what choice did she have? Ruthie couldn't walk to California in shoes that were falling apart. "It's okay, Mama," Ruthie said, seeing the worry on her mother's face. "They don't hurt that bad." "Don't lie to me, baby. I can see you limping. But if we spend money on shoes, we won't have money for food." Eleanor's heart broke. 6 years old and already understanding the brutal arithmetic of survival. "Don't you worry about that," she said firmly. "We'll manage. We always do." Clara was quiet, staring down the road toward Independence with an expression Eleanor couldn't quite read. "What if Papa's not in California?" she asked suddenly. "What? What if we walk all that way and he's not there? Or what if he is there, but he doesn't want us anymore? What do we do then?" Eleanor opened her mouth to reassure her daughter, to promise that everything would work out, but the lies stuck in her throat. She'd been lying to herself for months, pretending she believed Thomas would be there, would welcome them, would somehow make everything right. But the truth was, she had no idea what they'd find. The truth was, she was walking toward a dream that might be a nightmare. "I don't know," she admitted quietly. "But whatever we find, we'll face it together. That's all I can promise you, Clara, that we'll face it together." "Maybe we should stop," Clara said. "Maybe we should stay somewhere. Maybe Independence has work, or maybe Mr. Holt would let us—" "No," Eleanor's voice was sharp. "We can't go back. We can't be a burden on Caleb any more than we already have been. He's been generous, but there's a limit to every kindness. We have to stand on our own feet." "But what if we can't?" Clara's eyes were wet now, her composure cracking. "What if we're not strong enough, Mama? What if we fail?" Eleanor pulled both girls close, wrapping them in the blanket in her arms. "We won't fail," she said fiercely. "We can't. We've come too far, survived too much. We're going to make it because we have to. Because the alternative is giving up, and we don't know how to do that. Do you hear me?" Clara nodded against her mother's shoulder. Ruthie just held on tight, her small body shaking with cold or emotion or both. They sat there on the side of the frozen road, 3 people who had nothing except each other, and Eleanor tried to believe her own words, tried to believe that will and determination would be enough. They were just about to start walking again when Eleanor heard it, the sound of horses, moving fast, coming from the south. She turned and saw riders cresting the rise behind them, maybe a half-dozen men on horseback, kicking up dust despite the frozen ground. Something about the way they rode set alarm bells ringing in Eleanor's head. "Come on," she said urgently, pulling the girls to their feet. "We need to move." "Why?" Ruthie asked. "Who are they?" "I don't know, and I don't want to find out. Come on, quickly." They started walking faster, almost running, but the horses were faster. The riders caught up to them within minutes, circling around to block the road. Eleanor's blood went cold. These weren't travelers. These weren't settlers or ranchers going about their business. These were men who rode with purpose, with weapons visible on their saddles, with faces that spoke of hard living and harder intentions. The leader, a man with a scarred face and eyes like flint, pulled his horse to a stop directly in front of Eleanor. "Well now," he said, his voice carrying an accent Eleanor couldn't place. "What do we have here? A woman and 2 little birds, all alone on the road. That doesn't seem safe." Eleanor pulled the girls behind her, her heart hammering. "We're just passing through, not looking for trouble." "Nobody's ever looking for trouble," the man said, swinging down from his saddle. "But trouble finds them anyway. Isn't that interesting?" The other riders had dismounted too, forming a loose circle around Eleanor and her daughters. She counted 6 men total, all armed, all looking at them with expressions that made her skin crawl. This was bad. This was very bad. "Please," she said, fighting to keep her voice steady, "just let us pass. We have nothing worth taking." "Oh, I wouldn't say that." The leader stepped closer, his eyes traveling over Eleanor in a way that made her feel sick. "You've got provisions there. That blanket looks warm. And as for nothing worth taking, he smiled, showing broken teeth. Well, that's a matter of perspective, isn't it? One of the other men laughed, a sound like rocks scraping together. Eleanor's hand found the knife Caleb had given her, hidden in her pocket. It wasn't much against 6 armed men, but it was something. If they tried to hurt her daughters, she'd fight. She'd die fighting if she had to. I asked you nicely, the leader said, his voice hardening. Hand over the sack, the blanket too, and any money you've got. Do it now, and maybe we'll let you go on your way. Make this difficult and, well, he shrugged. I'm sure you can imagine. Mama, Ruthie whimpered, pressing against Eleanor's legs. Eleanor's mind raced. She could give them what they wanted. The provisions, the blanket, the $5. Material things, replaceable. But would they stop there? Would they really let them go? The way these men were looking at her suggested they wouldn't. Suggested they wanted more than just supplies. She was just about to make a decision, hand over the sack and pray or fight and die trying, when she heard it. Another horse, approaching fast from the north. The riders heard it too, turning to look. A single rider crested the hill, moving at full gallop, and even from a distance Eleanor recognized the horse, the way the man sat in the saddle. Caleb. He pulled up hard, his horse dancing sideways, and in his hands was a rifle, already leveled at the leader. Step away from them, Caleb said, his voice carrying across the frozen air. Step away right now. The leader turned, assessing this new threat. This your woman? Does it matter? Might. If she's yours, we could negotiate. If she's not, well, this isn't your concern. I'm making it my concern. Caleb's rifle didn't waver. Those are people under my protection. You touch them, you answer to me. One of the other riders laughed. There's 6 of us, and one of you, friend. You want to reconsider that threat? Not a threat. A promise. Caleb's eyes were cold, harder than Eleanor had seen them. I've got 8 shots in this Henry rifle, and I can reload faster than you can blink. I'll take at least 4 of you before you take me down. Question is, which 4 want to die today? The silence that followed was taut as a bowstring. Eleanor held her breath, clutching her daughters, watching the men calculate odds and outcomes. The leader's hand moved toward his pistol, but Caleb shifted the rifle slightly, and the movement was enough to freeze him. Your choice, Caleb said quietly. Ride away and live, or stay and test whether I'm bluffing. But you should know, I don't bluff. The leader stared at Caleb for a long moment, weighing his options. Then, slowly, he remounted his horse. You're making a mistake, he said. These roads aren't safe. We were just offering protection. They don't need your protection. They have mine. The leader spat in the dirt. Fine, keep them. But you remember this, friend. Kansas is a big territory and you can't be everywhere. Next time we meet might go differently. If there's a next time, Caleb said, I'll be ready. The riders wheeled their horses and rode north, not hurrying but not dawdling either, and Eleanor watched them go with a mixture of relief and residual terror. When they were finally out of sight, her legs gave out, and she sat down hard on the frozen ground, pulling the girls with her. Caleb dismounted and came to them quickly, kneeling beside Eleanor. Are you hurt? Did they touch you? Eleanor shook her head, unable to speak. Now that the danger had passed, the fear caught up with her, and she was shaking so hard her teeth chattered. Claire was crying silently, and Ruthie had buried her face in Eleanor's shoulder, making small, frightened sounds. It's okay, Caleb said gently, though his jaw was tight with anger. They're gone. You're safe. How did you know? Eleanor finally managed. How did you find us? I didn't like the look of those riders when they passed my place earlier. Something about them felt wrong, so I saddled up and followed. He touched Eleanor's shoulder carefully. Good thing I did. They were going to rob us, or worse. I know, that's why I came. Caleb stood and offered his hand. Can you walk? I need to get you back to the cabin. Back? Eleanor looked up at him, confused. But we were going to Independence. Not anymore. Not today. Not until I'm sure it's safe. His expression was grim. Those men were raiders, Eleanor. I've heard about them. Small bands that prey on travelers, especially families. They're getting bolder because the law out here is thin and people are desperate. I should have warned you, should have thought... He cut himself off, his jaw working. I'm taking you back. You'll stay until I can arrange for you to travel with a larger group. Safety in numbers. But no arguments, please." Caleb's eyes met hers, and Eleanor saw fear there that matched her own. "I sent you out there and you nearly got hurt because of it. I won't make that mistake again. You're coming back with me." Eleanor wanted to protest, wanted to maintain her independence, but the truth was she was terrified. Those men would have hurt them, would have taken everything and maybe killed them afterward, left them bleeding on the side of the road where nobody would find them until spring. The thought made her stomach turn. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay." Caleb helped them to their feet and lifted Ruthie onto his horse, then Clara. "You walk alongside," he told Eleanor. "I'll lead. We'll move fast, but not too fast. If you see those riders again, you tell me immediately." They made their way back toward Caleb's homestead, moving quickly, Eleanor's eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of the raiders. But the prairie remained empty, the sky clear and cold and indifferent. When Caleb's cabin finally came into view, Eleanor felt relief so intense it made her dizzy. "Inside," Caleb said, helping the girls down. "Bar the door behind you. I need to stable the horse and check the perimeter." Eleanor ushered the girls inside and dropped the heavy wooden bar across the door. The cabin felt different now, not just warm but fortified, a stronghold against a hostile world. She got the fire going higher and wrapped the girls in blankets, checking them over for injuries even though the raiders hadn't touched them. "Are we staying here forever?" Ruthie asked in a small voice. "No, baby, just until it's safe to travel." "When will that be?" "I don't know." Clara was quiet, staring at the fire with an expression Eleanor couldn't read. "Mama," she said finally, "what if those men come here? What if they find us? Mr. Holt won't let them hurt us. But there were 6 of them and only 1 of him. He said he could kill 4, but that means 2 would still be alive. 2 could still hurt us." Eleanor had no answer for that logic. Instead, she pulled Clara close and held on tight. "We're safe here," she said, even though she wasn't sure it was true. "We're safe." When Caleb came back inside, his rifle was in his hands and his expression was serious. He set the weapon by the door within easy reach and added wood to the fire. "I checked around," he said. "No sign of them. But we should stay alert. Keep the door barred. Stay away from the windows." "Caleb, I'm sorry," Eleanor said. "This is my fault. We brought danger to your door. You didn't bring anything. Those men have been roaming these parts for weeks. It's not about you. It's about them being predators and you being vulnerable." He sat down heavily in his chair. "But I should have known better. Should have escorted you myself or waited until there was a wagon train passing through. I sent you out there alone and you almost paid the price." "You couldn't have known." "I should have." His hands were shaking slightly, Eleanor noticed. The confrontation had affected him more than he was letting on. "I should have protected you better." They sat in heavy silence as the afternoon waned into evening. Caleb kept getting up to check the windows, to make sure the door was secure, to verify his rifle was loaded and ready. Eleanor tried to keep the girls occupied, but Clara kept asking questions Eleanor couldn't answer, and Ruthie clung to her mother like she was afraid Eleanor would disappear. "Why are people so mean?" Ruthie asked eventually. "Why did those men want to hurt us?" Eleanor struggled for an answer. How did you explain evil to a 6-year-old? How did you make sense of senseless cruelty? "Some people are broken inside," she said finally. "And when you're broken, sometimes you break other people too. It's not right, but it's how it is." "Can broken people get fixed?" "Sometimes, if they want to be. But a lot of people don't want to be fixed. They just want to keep breaking things." Ruthie thought about this. "Mr. Holt was broken," she said, "because his wife died. But he's not mean, he's nice." "That's different, baby. Mr. Holt was sad, not evil. There's a difference." "Oh," Ruthie paused. "Are we broken?" The question hit Eleanor like a fist. Were they broken? Their family had fallen apart. Their home was gone. They were living on charity and desperation, one bad day away from complete disaster. If that wasn't broken, what was? "We're bent," Eleanor said carefully. "We're hurting, but we're not broken. As long as we have each other, we're whole enough." "Promise?" "I promise." But even as she said it, Eleanor wondered if she was lying. Maybe they were broken. Maybe that's why trouble followed them, why kindness felt like a miracle, why hope was so hard to hold on to. Maybe broken was all they'd ever be. Night fell early, the winter sun sinking below the horizon and taking what little warmth it had provided. Caleb lit candles and checked his rifle again, and Eleanor made a simple supper from the provisions they'd meant to take to Independence. They ate quietly, each lost in their own thoughts, jumping at every sound from outside. "Tell us a story," Clara said suddenly. "Please, Mr. Holt, tell us something happy." Caleb looked surprised, then thoughtful. "A happy story? Let me think." He was quiet for a moment, then began. "When I was a boy in Pennsylvania, maybe 10 years old, there was a traveling carnival that came through town once a year. They had rides and games and the most amazing performers, acrobats and jugglers, and a man who could swallow fire. My father would give me a whole quarter to spend however I wanted, and that quarter felt like a fortune." The girls leaned in, their eyes fixed on Caleb's face as he spun the tale. Eleanor listened too, grateful for the distraction, for the momentary escape from fear and uncertainty. Caleb's voice was warm and steady, painting pictures of a simpler time, a happier place, and for a little while the cabin felt less like a fortress and more like a home. When the story ended, Ruthie applauded softly. "More," she said. "Please tell another one." So Caleb did. He told them about Sarah, about how they'd met, about the time she'd tried to bake a pie and accidentally used salt instead of sugar. He told them about building this cabin, about the day he'd finished the roof and stood on the ridge beam and shouted his triumph to the empty prairie. He told them about small joys and simple pleasures, about moments of grace in an ungracious world. And slowly, gradually, the tension in the cabin eased. The girls relaxed. Eleanor felt her shoulders unknot. The danger was still out there. Those raiders were still somewhere in the Kansas night, but for now, in this moment, they were safe. Eventually, Eleanor put the girls to bed, tucking them in with extra care, pressing kisses to their foreheads. "Sleep," she whispered. "Tomorrow will be better." "Will we have to leave again?" Clara asked. "Not until it's safe. Mr. Holt will make sure it's safe." "Good. I like it here. I wish we could stay forever." Eleanor's throat tightened. "I know, baby. Me too." When the girls were finally asleep, Eleanor returned to the fire where Caleb sat cleaning his rifle with careful, practiced movements. She settled into the other chair and watched the flames dance. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for saving us today, for bringing us back here, for everything." Caleb didn't look up from his work. "Stop thanking me." "I can't. You keep saving our lives. I'm just doing what's right. Most people don't. Most people would have looked the other way, would have decided it wasn't their problem. But you didn't. You rode out there and faced down 6 armed men because you cared what happened to 3 strangers." "You're not strangers anymore," Caleb said simply. "And I couldn't live with myself if I'd let something happen to you." They sat in silence for a while, comfortable, despite the fear still lurking at the edges of the room. Outside, the Kansas night was black and cold and full of danger. Inside, the fire burned and the walls held, and 2 broken people sat together in the darkness, finding strength in shared vulnerability. "What happens now?" Eleanor asked finally. "Now we wait. In a few days, there should be a supply wagon heading north from Lawrence. I'll ride into town tomorrow, find out when it's coming through. You can travel with them, safety in numbers, like I said. And in the meantime? In the meantime, you stay here, you rest, you let me worry about the dangers outside." Eleanor wanted to protest, wanted to insist she could take care of herself and her daughters. But the truth was, she couldn't. Not alone. Not against men like those raiders. She needed help, needed protection, needed someone strong enough to stand between her family and the cruelty of the world. "I hate feeling helpless," she admitted. "You're not helpless. You're just outgunned. There's a difference." "Is there?" "Yes. Helpless means you can't do anything. Outgunned means you need allies. And you have one. You have me." The way he said it, simple, certain, absolute, made Eleanor's eyes burn with tears again. When was the last time someone had been on her side without conditions, without expectations? When was the last time she'd felt like someone actually cared whether she lived or died? Why? She whispered. Why do you care so much? Caleb finally looked up from his rifle, and in the firelight his eyes were soft. Because someone has to, he said. Because the world is hard enough without making it harder. Because you deserve better than what you've gotten. Because your girls deserve to grow up safe and whole. Because... He paused, seeming to struggle with the words. Because maybe helping you helps me, too. Maybe it gives me a reason to keep going. Maybe it makes Sarah's death mean something if I can use what I learned from it to help someone else survive. Eleanor understood. Grief needed purpose. Pain needed direction. Otherwise, it just consumed you from the inside until there was nothing left. Caleb had found his purpose in helping others, in being the kindness he'd been denied when he'd needed it most. Well, she said softly, if it helps, you're doing a good job. You're making a difference. You saved our lives today. We're not out of the woods yet. No, but we're still alive. That counts for something. Caleb nodded and went back to cleaning his rifle. Eleanor watched the fire and listened to her daughters breathe in sleep, and tried not to think about the raiders out there in the darkness. Tried not to imagine what would have happened if Caleb hadn't come. Instead, she thought about tomorrow, about the supply wagon, about eventually reaching independence, and then maybe, possibly, finding a way forward. The night deepened. The fire burned low, and in that small cabin on the Kansas prairie, 4 people who'd been brought together by circumstance and chance held on through the darkness, waiting for dawn and whatever it would bring. Outside, the world was hostile and uncertain. Inside, they had each other, and for now, that was enough. Eleanor closed her eyes and sent up a silent prayer, not to a God she wasn't sure she believed in anymore, but to whatever force governed fate and chance and the random kindness of strangers. Please, she thought, please let us survive this. Please let us find somewhere safe. Please let this not be the end. And somewhere in the darkness, either God or chance or blind luck heard her, because they made it through that night unharmed, and when morning came, the raiders were gone, blown away like smoke on the prairie wind, leaving nothing behind but memory and the knowledge that sometimes, against all odds, goodness wins. Morning brought no sign of the raiders, but it brought something else. A rider from the north, moving fast toward Caleb's homestead. Eleanor saw him through the window, a young man on a lathered horse, his face urgent, and her stomach clenched with fresh fear. Caleb was already outside, his rifle within reach, watching the rider approach with careful eyes. Eleanor kept the girls back from the window, her hand finding the knife in her pocket out of instinct. After yesterday, every stranger felt like a threat, every unexpected sound like danger approaching. But when the rider pulled up and dismounted, Caleb's shoulders relaxed slightly, and Eleanor dared to breathe. Through the half-open door, she heard voices. The young man was talking fast, gesturing north, his words carrying urgency but not aggression. Caleb asked questions, his tone measured, and the conversation went on for several minutes before the rider remounted and headed back the way he'd come. When Caleb came inside, his expression was troubled. "What is it?" Eleanor asked. "What's happened?" Caleb closed the door carefully before answering. "That was Samuel Peterson's boy, my neighbor about 3 miles north. There's been trouble. Those raiders hit another family last night, about 6 miles from here. Burned their wagon, took everything they had. The family made it out alive, but barely. They're at the Petersons' place now, and Samuel's gathering men to track the raiders down." Eleanor felt her blood run cold. "They're still out there?" "Yes, and they're getting bolder." Caleb moved to the mantel, checking his ammunition. "Samuel wants me to join the search party. They're meeting at his place in an hour." "But..." Eleanor stopped, unsure what she was objecting to. That he'd leave them alone? That he'd put himself in danger? That without him they had no protection? All of it felt true, and none of it felt fair to say aloud. Caleb saw her face, and his expression softened. "I know, but I can't just sit here while they're out there hurting people. Those raiders have to be stopped." "I understand. I just..." Eleanor took a breath. "Please be careful." "I will be, and you'll be safe here. I'm going to ask Mary Peterson to come stay with you while the men are gone. She's a good woman, steady in a crisis. Between the two of you, you'll be able to defend this place if you have to. Do you think they'll come here? I don't know, but I'm not taking chances. He pulled down a second rifle from above the door, smaller and lighter than his Henry. Do you know how to shoot? Eleanor shook her head. Thomas never taught me. He said guns were men's business. Caleb's jaw tightened. Well, they're your business now. Come here. I'll show you the basics. For the next 20 minutes, Caleb taught Eleanor how to load, aim, and fire the rifle. It was heavier than she'd expected, the kickback stronger, but after a few practice holds, she started to get the feel of it. You don't have to be a sharpshooter, Caleb told her. You just have to be willing to pull the trigger if someone comes through that door meaning harm. Can you do that? Eleanor thought about her daughters, about what men like those raiders would do to them if given the chance. Yes, she said firmly. I can do that. Good. Keep it loaded and within reach. If anyone comes who isn't me or Mary Peterson, you bar that door and you shoot first and ask questions later. Understand? I understand. Clara had been watching the lesson with wide eyes. Mama's going to protect us, she said to Ruthie, who was clinging to her sister's hand. She's got a gun now. Ruthie looked more scared than reassured, but she nodded bravely. Caleb knelt down in front of both girls. Your mama's the strongest woman I know, he told them. And Mrs. Peterson is coming to help. You're going to be safe here. But you have to listen to them, all right? If they tell you to hide, you hide. If they tell you to be quiet, you're silent as mice. Can you do that for me? Both girls nodded solemnly. Clara said, Are you going to catch the bad men? We're going to try. What if they hurt you? They won't. I'm careful and I'm angry, and angry, careful men are hard to hurt. He stood and touched Clara's cheek gently. Don't worry about me. I'll be back before you know it. But Clara's eyes said she didn't believe him, and Eleanor suspected her own eyes said the same thing. The prairie had already taken so much from both of them. The thought of it taking Caleb too felt unbearable. Mary Peterson arrived within the hour, a sturdy woman in her 40s with kind eyes and capable hands. She carried a shotgun like it was an extension of her arm and wore a determined expression that suggested she'd seen trouble before and survived it. Samuel's told me the situation, she said, embracing Eleanor like they were old friends. You're Eleanor and these are your girls. Don't worry, dear. We'll hold this fort together. Caleb gathered his gear, rifle, ammunition, canteen, a bedroll in case the search took longer than expected. At the door he paused and turned back to Eleanor. For a moment they just looked at each other, and Eleanor saw in his eyes everything she was feeling: fear, determination, the weight of responsibility, the fragile hope that somehow they'd all survive this. Be safe, she said, because there were other words she wanted to say but couldn't, words that felt too big and too complicated for the short time they'd known each other. You too. Mary will take care of you. I know. Eleanor. He stopped, seeming to struggle with something, then just shook his head. I'll be back. I promise. Don't make promises you can't keep. I don't. And with that he was gone, mounting his horse and riding north toward the Petersons' place where the other men were gathering. Eleanor watched from the window until he disappeared over a rise, then turned to find Mary watching her with knowing eyes. He's a good man, Mary said softly. Best we've got in these parts. If anyone can track those raiders and come back alive, it's Caleb Holt. How long have you known him? 3 years since he first came out here with Sarah. We were the closest neighbors, helped them build this cabin. Watched him fall apart after she died, then watched him put himself back together piece by piece. It's been hard on him, living alone with all that grief. I'm glad he's found someone to care about again. Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks. He doesn't care about me. He's just being kind. Mary smiled. Dear, I've known Caleb long enough to recognize when he cares. The way he looks at you and those girls. That's not just kindness. That's something deeper. Eleanor didn't know how to respond to that, so she changed the subject. What do we do now? Just wait? We wait and we prepare. If those raiders come this way, we need to be ready. Mary moved through the cabin with practiced efficiency, checking the bar on the door, examining the shutters on the windows, positioning furniture to create barriers. Samuel says there were 6 of them yesterday, but one of the families they hit last night swears there were 8. They might be joining up with others, getting bolder. We can't take any chances. The day passed slowly, measured in heartbeats and anxious glances out the window. Mary kept them busy. She had Eleanor help her prepare food, showed the girls how to roll bandages from clean cloth, taught Clara how to reload the shotgun. Skills every frontier woman needs, Mary said matter-of-factly. My mother taught me when I was younger than you. Out here, everyone has to know how to defend themselves. Clara absorbed the lesson with serious concentration, her small hands surprisingly steady as she worked. Ruthie mostly stayed close to Eleanor, sensing the tension in the air even if she didn't fully understand it. Every so often she'd ask, "When is Mr. Holt coming back?" And Eleanor would have to say, "Soon, baby, soon." But as afternoon bled into evening and evening into dusk, there was still no sign of Caleb or the search party. Mary tried to hide her worry, but Eleanor could see it in the way she kept checking the windows, the tightness around her eyes. They lit no candles as darkness fell, not wanting to advertise their presence. Instead, they sat by the dying fire, speaking in whispers, listening to every sound from outside. "Tell me about your husband," Mary said quietly, once the girls had finally fallen asleep. "The one who went to California." Eleanor had almost forgotten about Thomas, had been so consumed with immediate survival that the larger purpose of their journey had faded into background noise. Now forced to think about him, she found her feelings were more complicated than she'd expected. "His name is Thomas," she said slowly. "We married when I was 17. He was kind then, or I thought he was. Maybe I just didn't know what real kindness looked like. He worked hard, provided for us, but there was always this restlessness in him, like he was looking for something he could never quite find. And he thought he'd find it in California? He thought he'd find gold, thought it would solve all our problems, make us rich, give him the respect he craved. I tried to tell him we had enough, that what we had in Ohio was good, but he couldn't hear it. The bank was taking the farm, and he couldn't face that failure. So he left, promised he'd send for us, and disappeared." Mary was quiet for a moment. "Do you still love him?" Eleanor had to think about that. Did she love Thomas? Or did she love the idea of him, the memory of who he'd been before disappointment had hardened him? "I don't know," she admitted. "I love who he was. I'm not sure I love who he became. Does that make sense?" "Perfect sense. People change. Sometimes they change into someone we can't recognize anymore." "Have you ever wanted to leave Samuel, your husband?" "Lord, yes." Mary laughed softly. "Every marriage has those moments, especially out here where life is hard and privacy is scarce. But Samuel and I, we chose each other fresh every morning. Even on the days I wanted to brain him with a skillet, I chose to stay. That's what marriage is, really. Not the wedding, not the pretty promises, but the daily choice to keep choosing each other." "Thomas stopped choosing us." "Then maybe you need to stop choosing him." Mary met Eleanor's eyes across the dim room. "I don't know your whole story, dear, and I'm not telling you what to do. But sometimes people leave our lives, through death or abandonment or just drifting apart, and we have to decide whether to spend the rest of our days chasing their ghost or to turn around and look at what's actually in front of us." Eleanor thought about that. What was in front of her? 2 daughters who needed stability. A dangerous journey to a place where Thomas might not even be. And behind her, if she chose to look back, a man who'd risked his life to save theirs, who'd shown them more genuine care in 4 days than Thomas had shown in the last 2 years. But those thoughts felt dangerous, felt like betrayal, even though Thomas had betrayed them first. Eleanor wasn't ready to examine them too closely, not yet, not while everything was still so uncertain. "You care about him," Mary said, reading Eleanor's silence correctly. "About Caleb. He's been kind. It's more than that." Eleanor wanted to deny it, but the words stuck in her throat. Was it more than that? She'd known Caleb for less than a week. That wasn't long enough to develop feelings, to start imagining possibilities, to look at a man and see not just a savior, but a potential future. Was it? "I don't know what I feel," she said finally. "Everything's too confused, too complicated. I just want my girls to be safe. That's all I can think about right now." Mary nodded, accepting this. "Well, when you're ready to think about more than just survival, you remember what I said. Life's too short to spend it chasing people who left. Sometimes the best thing you can do is turn around and see who stayed." They fell into silence after that, each lost in their own thoughts. The night deepened. The fire burned down to embers. And still there was no sign of Caleb or the men. Eleanor tried not to imagine the worst, tried not to picture him lying wounded somewhere on the prairie, tried not to think about raiders ambushing the search party, tried not to consider the possibility that he might not come back at all. Around midnight, Mary finally dozed off in her chair, the shotgun across her lap. Eleanor kept watch, unable to sleep, every nerve alert for sounds from outside. The Kansas night was full of noises, wind in the grass, animals moving in the darkness, the settling of the cabin's timbers, and each one made her heart race. She must have dozed eventually, because she woke with a start to the sound of horses outside, multiple riders approaching in the pre-dawn darkness. Eleanor grabbed the rifle Caleb had left her, her hands shaking as she moved to the window. Mary was awake instantly, positioning herself by the door with the shotgun ready. "Who's there?" Mary called out, her voice steady despite the fear Eleanor could see in her face. "It's Samuel," came the reply. "We're back. Everyone's safe." Mary sagged with relief and lifted the bar. The door opened to reveal Samuel Peterson and 4 other men, all of them exhausted and dirty but alive. And behind them, leading his horse, was Caleb. Their eyes met across the dim cabin, and Eleanor felt something in her chest loosen, some tension she'd been holding for 12 hours finally releasing. He was alive. He'd come back. The men filed in, accepting the coffee Mary immediately started making, talking in low voices about the night's events. They'd tracked the raiders east toward the Missouri border, but lost the trail when a creek flooded from snowmelt. The raiders had scattered or hidden, or simply vanished into the vast prairie. They'd return with more men, Samuel said, organize a proper posse, but for now the immediate threat seemed to have passed. "The family that was attacked," Eleanor asked, "are they all right?" "Shaken, but alive," Samuel replied. "We brought them to our place. Mary, they'll need clothes and food. The raiders took everything." "I'll sort them out tomorrow," Mary promised. "For now, let's all get some rest." The men dispersed to their homes as dawn broke gray and cold over the prairie. Caleb saw Samuel and Mary to the door, thanking them for their help, promising to ride over later to check on the displaced family. When they were finally gone, and it was just Caleb and Eleanor and the still sleeping girls, the cabin felt suddenly very quiet. "You're hurt," Eleanor said, noticing blood on Caleb's sleeve. "It's nothing, just a scratch from some thorns." "Let me see." "Eleanor." "Let me see," she repeated, more firmly this time. Caleb sighed and shrugged out of his coat. The scratch was actually a deep gash along his forearm, still seeping blood. Eleanor fetched water and clean cloth, and Caleb sat while she cleaned and bound the wound with hands that were surprisingly steady. "You should have someone look at this properly," she said. "It might need stitches." "It'll heal. I've had worse." "That's not the point." "Then what is the point?" Eleanor tied off the bandage perhaps more firmly than necessary. "The point is you matter. The point is you can't keep throwing yourself into danger and pretending you're invincible. The point is—" She stopped, suddenly aware of how close they were, of Caleb watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "The point is what?" he asked softly. "The point is, we need you," Eleanor finished, her voice barely above a whisper. "The girls and I, we need you to stay alive." Caleb's hand found hers, his rough fingers gentle against her palm. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. "I promised you I'd come back, and I did. I'll always come back." They stayed like that for a moment, hands clasped, the morning light filtering through the window and painting everything gold. Eleanor felt something shifting between them, something that had been building since that first night when he'd offered them his coat and called it nothing. It wasn't just gratitude anymore. It wasn't just the desperate attachment of someone drowning to someone solid. It was something deeper, more complicated, more terrifying. It was possibility. The moment broke when Clara stirred in bed, calling out for her mother. Eleanor pulled her hand away, suddenly self-conscious, and went to tend to her daughter. Behind her, Caleb stood and moved to the stove, starting breakfast like nothing had happened, but Eleanor could feel the change in the air between them. Something had been acknowledged, even if it hadn't been named. Over breakfast, Simple porridge, but hot and filling. Caleb told them his plan. "The supply wagon from Lawrence is coming through tomorrow," he said. "Samuel's son saw it in town yesterday. It'll pass by here mid-morning, heading to Independence. You can travel with them. The driver's a good man, and there'll be other families. You'll be safe." Eleanor nodded, even as something in her chest tightened. Tomorrow. They'd be leaving tomorrow. The thought should have brought relief. They were moving forward again, getting closer to their destination, but instead it brought a strange melancholy. "Thank you," she said, "for everything you've done. We'll never be able to repay you." "I don't want repayment. I just want you to be safe, to find what you're looking for." "And if what we're looking for doesn't exist?" Caleb met her eyes across the table. "Then you find something else. You build something new. You keep going. Is that what you did, after Sarah?" "I'm trying to. Every day I'm trying." Clara, who'd been eating silently, spoke up. "I don't want to go tomorrow. I want to stay here." "Clara," Eleanor said gently, "we've talked about this. We have to keep moving forward." "But why? Papa's probably not even in California. He's probably dead, or he forgot about us, or he found a new family. Why do we have to keep chasing someone who doesn't want to be found?" The words hung in the air like an accusation, all of Eleanor's private fears spoken aloud by her 8-year-old daughter. Eleanor felt her face flush with shame and anger and grief. "Don't talk about your father that way." "Why not? It's true. You know it's true. You're just too scared to say it." Clara Elizabeth Graves. "I'm right and you know it." Clara's voice rose, years of frustration and fear finally breaking through her controlled exterior. "We've been walking and starving and freezing and almost getting hurt by bad men, all because you won't admit that Papa's gone." "But he is gone, Mama. He's been gone since the day he walked away from us. And Mr. Holt is right here. He's real and he's kind and he cares about us. Why can't we just stay? Why do we have to keep pretending there's something better waiting somewhere else?" Eleanor felt like she'd been slapped. She opened her mouth to respond, to discipline, to reassert her parental authority, but no words came. Because Clara was right. Thomas was gone, had been gone for months, and Eleanor had been dragging her daughters across the frontier chasing a ghost, chasing the memory of who Thomas had been, or maybe just chasing her own stubborn refusal to admit failure. "Clara," Caleb said gently, "that's not fair to your mother. She's doing the best she can." "I know," Clara said, and now she was crying, 8 years of bottled emotion finally spilling over. "I know she's doing her best, but her best is killing us. We're so tired, Mr. Holt. We're so hungry and scared and tired, and I just want to stop. I just want to stay somewhere safe and warm where people are kind and nobody hurts us. Is that so wrong?" "No, sweetheart, it's not wrong at all." Ruthie had started crying too, overwhelmed by her sister's outburst. Eleanor gathered both girls to her, holding them as they sobbed, feeling her own tears start to fall. This was what she'd done to them. This was what her stubborn pride and desperate hope had cost. She'd turned her daughters into tiny refugees, always running, never resting, living in constant fear because she couldn't accept that sometimes people leave and they don't come back, and chasing them only makes the wound deeper. "I'm sorry," she whispered into Clara's hair. "I'm so sorry. You're right. You're both right. I've been selfish and stupid, and I haven't been listening to what you need. I'm sorry." They stayed like that for a long time, the three of them wrapped around each other, crying out months of accumulated fear and pain and exhaustion. Caleb quietly cleared the breakfast dishes and gave them privacy, understanding instinctively that this was a moment they needed together. When the tears finally subsided, when the girls had cried themselves into hiccuping silence, Eleanor pulled back and looked at both of them. "I need to tell you something," she said, "about your father, about why we're really going to California." Clara wiped her eyes. "We know why, to find Papa." "No, that's what I told you, but it's not the whole truth." Eleanor took a shaky breath. "The truth is, I don't know if your father is alive. I don't know if he ever made it to California, or if he struck gold, or if he just decided he didn't want to be with us anymore. And I've been too afraid to face that, too proud to admit that maybe he's not coming back. So I told myself we were going to find him, that everything would be fine once we reached California. But really, I was just running away from the truth. What truth? Ruthie asked in a small voice. That your father left us. That maybe he didn't mean to, maybe something happened to him, but the result is the same. He's gone, and we're alone, and we have to figure out how to live with that. Eleanor's voice cracked. I thought if we could just get to California, if we could just find him, then everything would go back to the way it was. But things never go back. They only go forward, and I've been dragging you forward towards something that probably doesn't exist. Clara processed this. So we're not going to California? I don't know. I don't know what we're doing anymore. Eleanor looked at Caleb, who was standing by the window, giving them space but listening. What do you think? What should we do? Caleb turned, his expression thoughtful. I think you need to make a choice that's about what you want, not about what you're running from or running toward. You need to ask yourself what's best for these girls, what's best for you, and then you need to do that thing even if it's hard. But what if I don't know what's best? Then you make your best guess and you commit to it. You stop second-guessing every decision. Stop living in this limbo between the past and the future. You choose a direction and you walk it. Eleanor looked at her daughters, at their red eyes and hopeful faces. She thought about Thomas, wherever he was. She thought about California and the dream that had become a nightmare. She thought about this cabin, this man, this unexpected pocket of safety they'd stumbled into. And she made a choice. We'll take the wagon to Independence tomorrow, she said slowly, but not to keep going to California, to find work, to find a place to stay, to build something stable for us. I'll look for your father. I owe him that much, owe us that much. But I won't sacrifice you girls anymore in the search. We're going to make a home, even if it's just a room at a boarding house. We're going to stop running. Clara's face brightened. Really? We're staying in Kansas? For now. Until we're stronger, until we have enough money to make real decisions instead of desperate ones. Is that all right? Yes, Clara breathed. Yes, Mama. That's perfect. Ruthie just nodded, exhausted from crying, but her relief was visible. Eleanor looked at Caleb and found him smiling slightly, that gentle expression she'd come to recognize as approval. Good choice, he said. Independence is a decent town. You'll find work there. Find your footing, and I'm only 8 miles away if you need anything. You've already done so much, and I'll keep doing it if you need me to. That's what neighbors do. That's what friends do. Friends. The word felt both too small and too large for what they were becoming, but Eleanor accepted it, held it close, let it be enough for now. The rest of the day passed in strange peace. The immediate danger had passed. The raiders were gone or scattered, and Eleanor had finally made a decision that felt right instead of desperate. She helped Caleb with small chores around the cabin, showing the girls how to gather eggs from the chickens and draw water from the well. Simple tasks, ordinary tasks, the kind of work that reminded her of Ohio and better days. That evening, Caleb produced a fiddle Eleanor hadn't known he owned and played simple songs while the girls danced by the fire. It was the first time Eleanor had seen them truly happy in months. Not just not miserable, but actually joyful. Ruthie twirled until she was dizzy, and Clara laughed, and for an hour the cabin was full of music and light instead of fear. When the girls finally collapsed into giggles on the floor, exhausted and happy, Caleb set down his fiddle and met Eleanor's eyes across the room. Something passed between them again, that understanding that went deeper than words. They'd both lost so much. They'd both been broken by this hard prairie life, but maybe, just maybe, they were learning how to heal. That night, after the girls were asleep and the fire burned low, Eleanor and Caleb sat together in comfortable silence. Tomorrow would bring the wagon and the journey to Independence and the next chapter of whatever story they were writing. But tonight they had this. Two people who'd found each other in the darkness, who'd chosen to be kind when kindness wasn't required, who'd reminded each other that humanity still existed even in the hardest places. Thank you, Eleanor said quietly, for everything, for saving us, for sheltering us, for helping me see what I needed to see. Thank you for trusting me, Caleb replied, for letting me help, for reminding me why I keep going. Will you come visit us? In Independence? If you want me to. I want you to. Caleb smiled. Then I will. Once you're settled, once you've found your footing, I'll come check on you, make sure you're managing. I'd like that. They sat in silence a while longer, and Eleanor let herself imagine a future that wasn't defined by loss and desperation. A future where she had work, and the girls had stability, and maybe, possibly, she had someone who cared whether she lived or died. It was a fragile hope, barely formed, but it was there. And after months of hopelessness, even fragile hope felt like a miracle. Eventually, they said goodnight and took their places. Eleanor in the bed with her daughters, Caleb in his chair by the fire. And as Eleanor drifted off to sleep, she thought about choices and chances and the strange ways life brought people together. She thought about Thomas in California and the dreams she was finally letting go. And she thought about tomorrow, about independence, about starting over with nothing but her daughters, and the kindness of a man who'd shown them what real goodness looked like. It wasn't the future she'd imagined, but maybe it was the one she needed. Maybe sometimes the best thing you could do was stop chasing what was gone and start building what could be. Maybe that was what courage really meant, not refusing to give up, but knowing when to change direction. Eleanor closed her eyes and let herself believe it. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new uncertainties, but for tonight they were safe, warm, and together. And that was enough. The wagon came at mid-morning just as Caleb had predicted, creaking up the frozen road with 2 families aboard and a driver who'd seen enough frontier hardship not to ask too many questions. Eleanor stood in the doorway of the cabin with her daughters beside her, the burlap sack of provisions at her feet, and felt her heart pull in 2 different directions. Forward toward independence and whatever uncertain future waited there, or backward into the warmth of this cabin and the man who'd become her anchor in the storm. Caleb walked them to the wagon, carrying their few belongings, his face unreadable. The driver, a weathered man named Jenkins, nodded respectfully when Caleb explained that Eleanor and her girls needed passage to independence. "Room enough," Jenkins said simply. "Climb aboard." But before Eleanor could move, Caleb touched her arm gently, stopping her. "Wait," he said, his voice low. "There's something I need to say before you go." Eleanor's heart hammered. The girls had already climbed into the wagon, distracted by the other children aboard, giving them a moment of privacy. "What is it?" Caleb seemed to struggle with the words, his jaw working. Finally he said, "These last few days, having you here, having the girls, having people to care about again, it's reminded me what living feels like, not just surviving, living. And I know you need to go, need to find your own way, need to see if there's anything left of your old life worth holding on to. But Eleanor," he stopped, took a breath. "But I want you to know that if you don't find what you're looking for in independence, if Thomas is truly gone, if you need somewhere to come back to, this door will always be open. For you and for Clara and for Ruthie. Always." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. "Caleb, I can't ask you to—" "You're not asking, I'm offering. There's a difference." He glanced at the wagon, at Jenkins waiting patiently. "Go to independence. Find work. Find stability. Find answers if you can. But remember that you have a choice. You don't have to keep walking forever. You can come home if you want to." "Home," Eleanor repeated softly, testing the word. When had this cabin become home? When had this man become someone she couldn't imagine leaving? "Yes, home." Caleb's eyes held hers. "I'm not asking you to decide now. I'm just asking you to remember. Will you do that?" "I'll remember," Eleanor whispered. "How could I forget?" Caleb helped her into the wagon, his hand lingering on hers for just a moment longer than necessary. Then he stepped back, raised his hand in farewell, and Eleanor watched him grow smaller as the wagon rolled away. She watched until he was just a silhouette against the gray Kansas sky, until the cabin was a small dark square on the endless prairie, until everything that had become precious to her was behind her, and the uncertain future was ahead. Clara pressed against her side. "We'll see him again, won't we, Mama?" "Yes, baby, we'll see him again." "Promise?" Eleanor thought about promises, about how many had been broken, about whether she had any right to make more. But she looked at her daughter's hopeful face and said, "I promise." The ride to Independence took 3 hours over rutted roads, and Eleanor spent them talking quietly with the other families in the wagon. They were all heading west eventually: Oregon, California, somewhere the land was supposedly better and opportunities more plentiful. They asked where Eleanor was going, and she told them the truth. She didn't know yet. She was looking for someone, but mostly she was looking for a place to stop running. One of the women, older and kind-faced, patted Eleanor's hand. "Sometimes the best thing we find is what we weren't looking for," she said. "You keep your eyes open, dear. The answer might surprise you." Independence was bigger than Eleanor had expected. A proper town with a main street, a church, several stores, and the boarding house Caleb had described. The white paint was peeling, and the sign did indeed say Hayes House. And when Eleanor knocked on the door with her daughters beside her, a sturdy woman with steel gray hair answered. "Mrs. Hayes?" Eleanor asked. "My name is Eleanor Graves. Caleb Holt sent me. He said you might have a room." Recognition sparked in the woman's eyes. "Caleb sent you? Well then, you must be decent folk. Come in, come in. Let's see what we can work out." Martha Hayes was brisk but fair, exactly as Caleb had described. She had one small room available, barely big enough for a bed and a washstand. But the price was reasonable, and she offered Eleanor work in exchange for reduced rent. "I need help with the cooking and cleaning," Martha said. "My daughter used to help, but she married and moved to St. Louis. Can you cook?" "Yes, ma'am. And clean and mend and do laundry, whatever you need." "Then we have a deal. Room and board for you and the girls, plus a small wage. You work hard and don't cause trouble. We'll get along fine." It was more than Eleanor had hoped for. She took Martha's offered hand and shook it firmly, feeling something settle in her chest. This was the first step. This was stability, however fragile. This was choosing to build instead of chase. The room was tiny and the bed sagged in the middle, but it had 4 walls and a door that locked, and after sleeping rough for months, it felt like luxury. Eleanor unpacked their few belongings, the knife Caleb had given her, the extra blanket, the remaining provisions, and arranged them carefully. Clara and Ruthie explored every corner, marveling at the window with real glass and the washstand with an actual pitcher. "Is this ours?" Ruthie asked. "Really ours?" "For now, baby, for as long as we need it." "I like it. It's cozy." Eleanor had to smile. Only a 6-year-old could call a room barely big enough to turn around and cozy. But Ruthie was right. It was theirs, and that made it precious. Eleanor started work that same afternoon, helping Martha prepare dinner for the boarders. There were 6 other people staying at Hayes' house, a traveling salesman, 2 prospectors heading to California, a widow woman, and a young couple with dreams of Oregon. Eleanor served them stew and bread and listened to their stories, and for the first time in months she felt like part of something, like she belonged somewhere. After dinner, while the girls played with a rag doll Martha had found for them, Eleanor asked the question that had been burning in her mind since they'd arrived. "Mrs. Hayes, have you heard of any men coming through here from California? Or any news from the goldfields? I'm trying to find my husband. He went west last summer, and I haven't heard from him since." Martha's expression grew cautious. "What's his name?" "Thomas. Thomas Graves. He's tall, dark hair, about 35 years old. He was heading to the California goldfields to strike it rich and send for his family," Martha finished, her voice heavy with something Eleanor couldn't identify. "Yes, dear, I've heard that story about 100 times. I'm sorry, but I don't recall anyone by that name. What I can tell you is that most men who go to California chasing gold don't find what they're looking for, and the ones who do find gold often don't come back. The gold fever gets in them, and they forget they ever had another life." Eleanor absorbed this, feeling something inside her crack, but not quite break. "So you think he's not coming back?" "I think you need to prepare yourself for that possibility. I'm not saying give up hope. Hope is what keeps us going. But don't hang your whole life on a man who walked away from you. You've got 2 beautiful girls who need you here, now, in the present. Don't sacrifice them for a ghost." The words echoed what Mary Peterson had said, what Clara had said, what Eleanor's own heart had been trying to tell her for months. Thomas was gone. Whether he was dead or had simply chosen not to return, the result was the same. She couldn't keep chasing him. She had to let him go. "Thank you," Eleanor said quietly, "for your honesty. Out here on the frontier, honesty's all we've got. Pretty lies won't keep you warm or fed. You need truth, even when it hurts." That night, lying in the sagging bed with her daughters pressed against her sides, Eleanor made her decision. She would stay in Independence for now. She would work for Martha, save money, build stability for her girls. She would ask around about Thomas, write letters to California, inquire with travelers, do what she could to find out what had happened to him. But she wouldn't let the search consume her. She wouldn't sacrifice the present for a past that was gone and a future that might never exist. And when she was ready, when she'd proven to herself that she could stand on her own 2 feet, she would go back to Caleb's cabin and see if his offer still stood. Because somewhere between eating rotten apples and learning to load a rifle, between sleeping in a stranger's bed and watching him ride off to fight raiders, Eleanor had fallen in love with a man who'd shown her what real kindness looked like. It wasn't the love she'd had with Thomas, young and idealistic and blind to reality. This was something deeper, something built on shared pain and mutual respect and the bone-deep understanding that comes from surviving hard things together. It was a love that knew suffering and chose hope anyway. It was a love that didn't ask for perfection but settled for presence, for showing up, for doing the right thing even when it was hard. But she couldn't go to Caleb with nothing. She couldn't arrive at his door still broken, still desperate, still needing to be saved. She had to save herself first. She had to prove she could build a life before she could share one with someone else. So she waited. Days turned into weeks. Eleanor worked harder than she'd ever worked, cooking and cleaning and doing laundry until her hands were raw and her back ached. But every night she had food in her belly, and her daughters had full stomachs, and they slept in a real bed, in a real room. It was enough. It was more than enough. Clara enrolled in the small school Independence had, just a one-room building with a tired teacher, but Clara devoured learning like she'd been starving for it. Ruthie was still too young for school, but she helped Eleanor with small tasks and played with the other children in the boarding house and slowly, gradually, started to laugh again. Eleanor asked everyone who passed through about Thomas. She described him to prospectors and travelers, wrote letters to California settlements that might never be received. Most people shook their heads, said they hadn't seen him, offered condolences that felt like funeral rites. A few claimed they might have known someone matching his description, but the details never quite lined up, and Eleanor learned to recognize false hope when she heard it. 6 weeks after arriving in Independence, a letter came. Martha brought it to Eleanor with a grave expression, and Eleanor's hands shook as she opened it. It was from a mining camp in California, written by a man who signed himself Samuel Chen. He wrote in careful English that he had known a Thomas Graves, that they'd worked the same claim for a time, that Thomas had talked often about his wife and daughters back in Ohio. Past tense. Had talked. Eleanor's eyes blurred as she read the rest. Thomas had died in January, a mining accident, a tunnel collapse, quick and probably painless. He'd asked Samuel to write to his family if anything happened, had given him Eleanor's name and their old address in Ohio. Samuel had tried to send the letter there, but it had been returned. He'd been trying to track down the family ever since, asking around, and had finally heard that a woman named Eleanor Graves was inquiring about her husband in Kansas settlements. There was money too, $47 that Thomas had saved, that Samuel was arranging to have sent through a bank. He never stopped talking about you, Samuel had written. He never stopped trying to make enough to bring you west. He loved you until the end. I thought you should know that. Eleanor sat down hard on her narrow bed, the letter clutched in her hands, and felt everything she'd been holding together finally, completely fall apart. Thomas was dead. He hadn't abandoned them. He'd been trying to save them, trying to build something, trying to be the man he'd promised to be, and he died alone in a dark tunnel, probably thinking about them, probably believing he'd failed. She cried for a long time, for Thomas, for the marriage they'd had, for all the what-ifs and might-have-beens. She cried for the dreams they'd dreamed together and the future they'd never have. Clara and Ruthie held her, not quite understanding but knowing their mother needed comfort, and they cried too because grief was contagious and their father was truly, finally, gone. But underneath the grief, Eleanor felt something else. Relief. Not relief that Thomas was dead, God no, never that, but relief that she finally knew, relief that the uncertainty was over, relief that she could stop wondering and waiting and hoping for something that would never come, relief that she could grieve and heal and eventually, maybe, move forward. That evening, Eleanor told the girls what had happened. She read them Samuel Chen's letter, explained as gently as she could that their father had died trying to make a better life for them. Ruthie cried and asked questions Eleanor couldn't answer. Clara was quiet for a long time, processing in that serious way she had, and finally said, "Did he know we loved him?" "Yes, baby. He knew. He always knew." "Then that's what matters," Clara said, with the wisdom of someone much older. "He knew he was loved. That's better than a lot of people get." Eleanor pulled both girls close and held them while they cried together. Their little family had gotten even smaller, but they still had each other. They still had love. And now, finally, they had closure. They could mourn properly, grieve cleanly, and when they were ready, they could let Thomas rest in peace. The $47 arrived 3 weeks later. It was more money than Eleanor had seen in months, a small fortune that represented Thomas's last gift to his family. She could use it to go to California, she supposed, could use it to try to find the life Thomas had wanted for them. But Eleanor had learned something over these hard months. California was just a place. It wasn't redemption or salvation or a fresh start. Those things had to come from within. So she kept the money safe, saved it for emergencies, and stayed in independence. She kept working for Martha, kept building the small, stable life she'd started. And on Sundays, her only day off, she would take the girls and walk south toward Caleb's cabin, though they never quite made it all the way. She'd stand on a rise where she could just see his homestead in the distance and wonder if he thought about them, if he remembered his offer, if the door would really be open if she ever found the courage to knock on it. Spring came to Kansas like a revelation. The frozen prairie thawed and turned green, wildflowers appeared in impossible colors, and the sky stretched blue and endless overhead. Eleanor had been in Independence for nearly 4 months now, and she'd saved almost $20 of her own in addition to Thomas's money. The girls were healthy and happy, Clara was excelling in school, and Eleanor had made friends with some of the other women in town. She was doing it. She was building a life. She was standing on her own feet. One warm April morning, Martha called Eleanor into her private sitting room. "I need to talk to you," she said, her expression serious. "I've had an offer on this place, a buyer from St. Louis who wants to turn it into a proper hotel. He's offering good money, enough that I can retire comfortably, maybe move closer to my daughter." Eleanor's stomach dropped. "You're selling." "I'm thinking about it, but that would mean you'd need to find other work, other lodging. I wanted to tell you first, give you time to prepare." "How much time?" 2 months, maybe 3. I haven't decided yet, but Eleanor—" Martha's expression softened. "You've been the best help I've ever had. You're honest and hardworking and good with the boarders. Any household would be lucky to have you. Or what?" Martha smiled slightly. "Or you could stop pretending you don't know where you want to be and go to the man who's been asking about you every time he comes to town." Eleanor's heart skipped. "Caleb's been here? In Independence?" "Every other week, like clockwork. Comes in for supplies, always stops to ask how you're doing, always looks disappointed when I tell him you're well and settled. That man is waiting for you, dear. The question is, how long are you going to make him wait?" Eleanor thought about that for the rest of the day, through dinner and dishes and putting the girls to bed. She thought about Caleb and his cabin and the way he'd looked at her that last morning. She thought about Thomas and the life she'd lost and the grief she'd finally processed. She thought about what she wanted versus what she thought she should want. And she realized Martha was right. She'd been using work and saving money and building stability as excuses. But really she was just scared. Scared to want something. Scared to risk her heart again. Scared that if she went to Caleb, he might have changed his mind, or she might fail, or it might all fall apart. But fear was just another form of running, and Eleanor was tired of running. The next morning was Sunday. Eleanor dressed carefully, put on her best dress, still worn but clean, and braided the girls' hair with extra care. "We're going on an adventure today," she told them. "Where?" Ruthie asked. "To see Mr. Holt." Clara's face lit up. "Really? Really, Mama?" "Really. It's time." They walked south under a perfect blue sky, and for once the prairie didn't feel hostile or endless. It felt like possibility. It felt like the road home. The 8 miles that had once seemed impossible passed beneath their feet like nothing, and before Eleanor was quite ready, Caleb's cabin came into view. He was outside, working in what looked like a new garden plot, his shirt sleeves rolled up and his hat pushed back. He didn't see them at first, and Eleanor had a moment to just watch him, this man who'd saved them, who'd shown them kindness, who'd offered them home when they'd had nothing. Then Clara called out, "Mr. Holt!" And he turned, and the expression that crossed his face when he saw them was worth every hard mile, every difficult choice, every moment of doubt. He dropped his tools and walked toward them, not running but moving with purpose, and when he reached them, his eyes went straight to Eleanor's face. "You came," he said simply. "You said the door would always be open. It is. It always will be. Even now? Even after months? Even after years? Even after forever?" Caleb's voice was rough with emotion. "Eleanor, I meant what I said. This is home if you want it to be. You and the girls, always." Eleanor felt tears slip down her cheeks, but they were good tears this time, healing tears. "Thomas is dead," she said. "I got word. He died in California trying to make enough money to send for us. He never stopped trying. He never abandoned us. I'm sorry, that must have been hard to learn." "It was, but it also set me free. Free to grieve properly, free to let go, free to—" She trailed off, suddenly shy. "Free to what?" Caleb asked gently. "Free to choose what comes next. Free to choose where I want to be." Eleanor met his eyes. "I want to be here, Caleb, if you'll have us. Not as charity, not as obligation, but as—" She struggled for the word. "As family, if that's something you want too." Caleb's answer was to pull her into his arms, holding her close, while Clara and Ruthie cheered and jumped around them. "I've wanted that since the moment I found you behind my barn eating rotten apples," he said against her hair. "I just didn't know if you'd ever want it too." "I do. God help me, I do." They stood like that for a long moment, just holding each other, two broken people who'd somehow managed to heal each other without even trying. Then Caleb pulled back and looked at the girls. "What do you two think? Would you like to stay here? Help me plant the garden and tend the chickens and make this place a real home?" "Yes!" Ruthie shouted, throwing herself at Caleb's legs. "Yes, yes, yes!" Clara was more restrained, but her eyes were shining. "Will you marry Mama? Make it official?" Caleb looked at Eleanor, his eyebrows raised. "Is that something you'd want? Eventually?" Eleanor thought about it. She'd been married before, had vowed to love and cherish and stay until death. Those vows had ended in a California mine tunnel, and she'd grieved them properly. But now there was room for new vows, new promises, new chances. "Yes," she said firmly. "Not today, not tomorrow, but someday soon. I want to marry you, Caleb Holt. I want to build a life with you. I want to plant roots and grow something beautiful from all this hardship. Is that foolish?" "That's the opposite of foolish. That's wise." Caleb smiled, and it transformed his whole face. "Let's do it then. Let's get married and build a family and prove that good things can come from bad beginnings." They were married 6 weeks later under an oak tree at the Petersons' place, with Mary Peterson crying happy tears and Samuel beaming with approval and half the settlement showing up to celebrate. Clara and Ruthie scattered wildflowers as vows were spoken, and Eleanor wore a simple dress Martha had helped her make, and Caleb promised to love her and her daughters for all his days. It wasn't a grand wedding, there was no expensive ring or elaborate feast, but there was joy, pure, uncomplicated joy. And there was hope, and there was love that had been earned through hardship and chosen consciously. That made it more precious than any fancy ceremony could have been. They returned to the cabin, now their cabin, their home, and began the work of building a life together. Caleb taught Eleanor and the girls how to work the land, how to plant and harvest and preserve food for winter. Eleanor taught him how to make a house feel like a home, with curtains on the windows and flowers in jars and children's laughter filling the rooms. Clara thrived with the stability, her old soul eyes finally looking young again. Ruthie grew taller and rounder, no longer the half-starved waif who'd eaten rotten apples, but a healthy child who knew where her next meal was coming from. Summer came and went. Harvest was good. Winter arrived and found them prepared, warm, safe, together. And in the spring, exactly 1 year after Eleanor had knocked on Caleb's door looking for the man who'd saved her, Caleb planted an apple tree beside the cabin. To remember, he said, digging the hole with steady hands. To remember where we started and how far we've come. Eleanor watched him plant it, this symbol of their beginning, and felt her heart overflow with gratitude. A year ago, she'd been desperate enough to steal rotten apples. Now she was planting new trees, growing new fruit, building new life. The transformation felt miraculous, impossible, like grace made visible. The years that followed weren't easy. Frontier life never was. There were hard winters and failed crops and illnesses that scared them. There were memories that haunted and grief that resurfaced and days when survival felt like the best they could hope for. But there was also love, steady and sure, and there was family, chosen and cherished, and there was home. Clara grew into a fierce, intelligent young woman who became a teacher like she'd always dreamed. Ruthie became a healer, learning herbs and medicine from Mary Peterson and serving the settlement with gentle hands. Eleanor and Caleb added 2 more children to their family, a son named Thomas after the man who'd died trying to save them, and a daughter named Sarah after the woman who'd taught Caleb about keeping promises. And the apple tree grew. It took years, like apple trees do. Years of patient tending, of watering through droughts, and protecting from frost, and trusting that eventually, if you did the work and had faith, something beautiful would emerge. There were seasons when Eleanor wondered if it would ever bear fruit, if all their effort would amount to anything. But then, on a perfect autumn morning when the Kansas sky was impossibly blue and the air smelled like harvest, Eleanor walked outside to find the tree heavy with fruit. Real fruit, not rotten, not desperate, but genuine red apples that gleamed in the sunlight like promises kept. She picked one carefully, feeling the weight of it in her palm, and bit into crisp sweetness. It was perfect. It was everything she'd dreamed of during those hungry months when perfection had seemed like something that existed only for other people. Caleb came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. "First fruit," he said. "Looks good." "It's beautiful," Eleanor whispered, her eyes filling with tears. "Everything we survived, everything we suffered through, it led to this, to fruit from a tree planted in hope, to a family built from broken pieces, to home." "Funny how that works," Caleb said softly. "How something rotten can lead you to something sweet. How the worst moments can become the foundation for the best ones." Eleanor turned in his arms to face him, this man who'd found her at her lowest and loved her into healing. "I used to think kindness was weakness," she said. "I thought survival meant being hard, never trusting, never letting anyone in. But you taught me different. You taught me that kindness is the strongest thing there is. That opening your door to strangers, giving your coat to someone cold, offering help without conditions, that's not weakness, that's courage." "You taught me something too," Caleb replied. "You taught me that grief doesn't have to be the end of the story, that you can lose everything and still rebuild, that love isn't diminished by having loved before, it's expanded by it." They stood there under the apple tree, surrounded by the life they'd built from nothing, and Eleanor felt a peace so complete it was almost overwhelming. This was what she'd been walking toward all those months on the road. Not California, not gold, not some fantasy of restored glory. Just this: home, family, love, fruit from a tree, planted in hope. Clara came out of the cabin, followed by Ruthie and the younger children, and they all gathered under the apple tree. Eleanor handed out the fruit, watching her children bite into sweetness that had been years in the making, and thought about the journey that had brought them here. The hunger, the fear, the desperate choice to steal rather than starve, the stranger who'd become savior and then partner and then love, the hard choices and harder miles, the grief processed and the hope rebuilt and the life constructed from ruins. "Mama," Ruthie said, apple juice running down her chin, "this is the best apple I've ever tasted." Eleanor laughed, thinking about those rotten apples behind Caleb's barn, about how far they'd come since then. "Me too, baby. Me too." That evening, as the sun set over their Kansas home and the family gathered for supper, Eleanor looked around the table at the faces she loved, Caleb's strong and steady, Clara's fierce and bright, Ruthie's gentle and kind, and the younger children's open and trusting. She thought about Thomas, hoped he'd found peace, hoped he knew that his daughters had survived and thrived. She thought about Sarah, whom she'd never met, but whom she thanked silently for teaching Caleb about keeping promises. And she thought about that November morning when she'd been caught stealing rotten apples, when a stranger had said, "Come in," and changed everything. How a moment of kindness had cascaded into a lifetime of love. How grace had found her when she'd stopped looking for it. How home had appeared when she'd finally stopped running and started building. "Guess kindness grows where you plant it," she said to Caleb across the table, echoing words he'd spoken years ago. Caleb smiled, understanding exactly what she meant. "And love," he added, "love grows where you plant it too, in the hardest soil, in the most unlikely places. You just have to be brave enough to tend it." "We were brave," Eleanor said, "both of us. Even when we were terrified, even when we had nothing, we were brave enough to try." "We were," Caleb agreed. "And look what grew." They finished supper and put the children to bed, and Eleanor stepped outside one last time before sleep. The apple tree stood dark against the star-filled sky, its branches heavy with fruit, its roots deep in Kansas soil. It was just a tree, but it was also a symbol, a reminder, a testament to the truth that sometimes the worst moments lead to the best ones, that rotten beginnings can yield sweet endings, that kindness, real, genuine, unconditional kindness, has the power to save lives. Eleanor touched the trunk gently, feeling the rough bark under her palm, and sent up a silent prayer of gratitude. For this tree, for this home, for this man who'd said, "Come in," when he could have said, "Go away." For the girls who'd survived with her. For the life they'd built from nothing but stubbornness and hope and each other. Behind her, the cabin door opened and Caleb's silhouette appeared. "Coming to bed?" In a minute, Eleanor turned to look at him, this man who'd become her whole world. "I was just thinking about how lucky we are, how close we came to missing each other entirely. But we didn't miss each other. We found each other exactly when we needed to. Divine intervention? Maybe. Or maybe just two broken people being brave enough to help each other heal. Does it matter which?" Eleanor considered this. "No," she decided. "I suppose it doesn't. The result is the same. We're here, we're together, we're happy. That's all that matters." She walked back to the cabin, to the man waiting in the doorway, to the children sleeping safe inside, to the life that had seemed impossible during those desperate months on the road. And as she crossed the threshold, as she came in, again and always, to the home that had saved her, Eleanor Graves Holt felt something she hadn't felt in years, complete. The door closed behind her. The Kansas night settled over the prairie, and in that small cabin under that first fruit apple tree, a family slept in peace, living proof that sometimes the darkest moments are just the soil from which the most beautiful things grow. That kindness saves lives. That home isn't a place but a choice, made fresh every morning, to keep choosing each other no matter what. And that sometimes, if you're very lucky and very brave, rotten apples can lead you home.